To Ancient Egypt. Rosalie David. History of Scholarship. Human remains, but an extensive religious and secular. Ancient Egypt. Rosalie David. History of Scholarship. Ancient Egypt has left the modern world a rich legacy. Not only are there well-preserved monuments, artifacts and human remains, but an extensive religious and secular literature has also survived. The following discussion of the religious beliefs and practices will attempt to show how all these sources enable us to understand and interpret ideas and concepts that originated over 5,000 years ago. Frankfurt 1961, Hornum 1971, Morenz 1973, Schaefer 1991. However, it must be stated that even this rich legacy can provide only a partial view of the civilization. The surviving archaeological evidence is fragmentary, owing on the one hand to environmental and geographical factors and, on the other, to political and cultural practices. Sites in the south of Egypt, better preserved than those in the north because of climatic and environmental variations, have attracted more attention from the excavators. Religious monuments, pyramids, tombs and temples, were largely constructed of stone, so that they would survive for eternity, whereas cities, towns and domestic buildings, mainly built of mud brick, have consequently suffered more destruction. This inequality of evidence profoundly affects our knowledge and understanding of the people's daily religious observances. It was only after Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs 200 years ago that scholars were able to translate and begin to understand the texts. Subsequently, intensive study of the language in all its forms has been required to enable scholars to interpret the inscriptions more accurately. There are, however, still areas which are open to discussion, particularly in connection with the religious texts. This uneven pattern of evidence has resulted in a marked variation in the interpretation and understanding of different periods of Egypt's history. There are few hard facts in the study of Egyptian civilization, and often only imprecise conclusions can be drawn. In addition, successive generations of scholars have approached the subject with a range of presuppositions. For example, early classical writers who visited Egypt proposed some fantastic explanations for the monuments they saw, while later Christian travelers in medieval and Renaissance times often interpreted the civilization in the context of the Bible. Today, despite our ability to read the inscriptions with some degree of certainty and although there are vastly improved archaeological techniques, the evidence is still subject to individual bias in its interpretation. Although it is now customary to try to assess the Egyptians within the context of their own civilization and beliefs rather than interpreting them from other religious and social viewpoints, many questions remain unresolved. For example, various explanations have been offered in connection with the facts associated with the biblical Exodus, while the true nature and motives of Akhenaten, as either a failed messiah, a political opportunist or a leader who would not have distinguished between religious and secular ideas, continue to inspire lively debate. Redford 1984. Sources: Archaeology and Literature. Chronology. Today, the chronology of ancient Egypt is based on the work of an ancient priest, Manetho, CP 63, and is divided into a series of dynasties. Historians have arranged these dynasties into groups and placed them within major historical periods: the Archaic period, dynasties 1 and 2, the Old Kingdom, dynasties 3 to 6, the First Intermediate period, dynasties 7 to 11, the Middle Kingdom, dynasty 12, the Second Intermediate period, dynasties 13 to 17, the New Kingdom, dynasties 18 to 20, the Third Intermediate period, dynasties 21 to 25, and the Late period, dynasties 26 to 31. This is shown in the Table 2.1. Because of the climatic and environmental conditions of Egypt, a wealth of evidence has survived which provides one of the most complete pictures of the development of an early society. The civilization lasted for over 5,000 years, and, Although evidence is relatively scanty for some periods, the monuments, artifacts and literary sources have survived in a remarkable state of preservation and, in many cases, can be used to interpret the Egyptians' religious beliefs and practices. Table 2.1 Chronological Table of Egyptian History. Period. Date. Dynasty. Predynastic period. c. 5000 c. 3100 BCE. Archaic period. c. 3100 c. 2890 BCE. c. 2890 c. 2686 BCE. 2. Old Kingdom. c. 2686 c. 2613 BCE. 3. c. 2613 c. 2494 BCE. 4. c. 2494 c. 2345 BCE. v. c. 2345 c. 2181 BCE. 6. First Intermediate Period. c. 2181 c. 2173 BCE. 7. c. 2173 c. 2160 BCE. 8. c. 2160 c. 2130 BCE. 9. c. 2130 c. 2040 BCE. X. c. 2133 c. 1991 BCE. 11. Middle Kingdom. 1991 to 1786 BCE. 12. Second Intermediate Period. 1786 to 1633 BCE. 13. 1786 c. 1603 BCE. 14. 1674 to 1567 BCE. 15. Circa 1684 to 1567 BCE. 16. Circa 1650 to 1567 BCE. 17. New Kingdom. 1567 to 1320 BCE. 18. 1320 to 1200 BCE. 19. 1200 to 1085 BCE. 20. Third Intermediate Period. 1085 to 945 BCE. XXI. 945 to 730 BCE. XXII. 817 minus 730 BCE. 23. 720 to 715 BCE. XIV. 715 to 668 BCE. XXV. Late Period. 664 to 525 BCE. XXVI. 525 to 404 BCE. XXVII. 404 to 399 BCE. XVI. 399 to 380 BCE. ZX. 380 to 343 BCE. XXX. 343 to 332 BCE. XXXI. Conquest by Alexander the Great. 332 BCE. Ptolemaic period. 332 to 30 BCE. Conquest by Romans. 30 BCE. Roman period. 30 BCE, 48th century CE. Archaeological Sites, Map 2.1. Many of the archaeological sites, including the pyramids and temples, have remained partially visible above ground, and were frequently visited by travelers during the Roman Empire and the medieval and Renaissance periods. Over the past 200 years, however, excavation has revealed many more sites, and there has also been an extensive program to clear sand and debris from the tombs and temples, so that the wall scenes and inscriptions have been revealed. This has enabled further study and translation of the inscriptions to be undertaken, thus allowing the ritual use of various parts of the temples to be determined. Egypt has two main types of archaeological site. There are settlement sites, the villages, towns, cities and fortresses where people lived, which were situated in the cultivated land on either side of the Nile or in the delta, and the cemeteries, often referred to as necropolises, which included royal burial places, pyramid complexes or other tombs, and private, non-royal, tombs or graves for the nobles, officials, craftsmen and peasants. There were also temples for the worship of the gods and dead rulers. The two main types were termed mortuary temples and cultus temples by Egyptologists of the 19th century CE, who claimed that, in the cultus temples, the resident deity was worshipped through regular rituals carried out by the king or high priest, while the mortuary temples were the locations for rituals performed by the king or high priest on behalf of the resident deity plus the dead, deified king who had built the temple, so that the living ruler could be carrying out rites for his future, dead, deified form, together with all the previous legitimate rulers who were known as the royal ancestors. However, more recent scholarship has shown, Schaefer 1998, that this division is misleading because it infers that each type of temple was limited to the cult of either a god or a king, and that the Egyptians themselves made a clear distinction between cultus and mortuary temples. It has been argued that the temples should not be divided in this simplistic way, because their functions were too varied and interwoven, and that these names are therefore inappropriate. The term cult complex is now used for all cultic enclosures, but where it is necessary to be more specific, royal cult complex now replaces mortuary temple and divine cult complex stands instead of cultus temple. Generally, the divine cult complex was used for the worship of a god and sometimes of a, usually, living king, whereas in the royal cult complex, the worship of a divine king, usually deceased, was maintained, sometimes accompanied by the worship of another god. Map 2.1. Egypt showing main sites. The divine cult complex was always built in the city or town, whereas in some periods the royal cult complex was attached to the king's burial place, as in the pyramid complexes, but at other times was a separate building which might be located some distance from the burial site, for example, the New Kingdom temples built on the west bank at Thebes. However, even when it was attached to the royal burial place, this cult complex's prime function was to accommodate the rituals that would transform the mortal king into an immortal, divine being. Tombs and temples were constructed of stone because they were intended to last for eternity, whereas houses, all municipal and military buildings, and even palaces were mainly constructed of perishable materials such as mud brick and wood, because they were regarded as replaceable. Egypt had a limited amount of available cultivated land, restricted to the delta and a fertile strip on either side of the Nile, and this was required for growing crops, rearing animals and housing the living. Therefore, from earliest times, it was deemed necessary to bury the dead outside this area, on the edges of the desert. Here, the environment provided by the heat and dryness of the sand created perfect natural conditions for preserving the tombs, their funerary contents and the bodies of the dead. This was in marked contrast to the settlement sites, which were subject to damage from the annual inundation of the river. Therefore, because of the different locations of the burial places and settlement sites, and because of the great variation in the durability of the materials used in their construction, archaeology has revealed much more about the tombs and their contents than about palaces, houses and articles of daily use. This imbalance of physical evidence has tended to produce a one-sided view of Egyptian civilization, but, in order to understand the society, it is essential to realize that they were not obsessed with death. It is simply that we have more evidence of their funerary beliefs than about their daily lives because a preponderance of the burial goods have survived. Artifacts. In addition to the standing monuments, archaeologists have uncovered a wide range of man-made objects, artifacts, which were either placed in the tombs or left behind in the houses. The Egyptians believed that people would require many articles for use in the life after death, and consequently they equipped their graves and tombs with a variety of goods. Some of these were funerary in purpose, and formed part of the beliefs and customs surrounding death and burial, whereas others were everyday items, supplied so that the deceased could continue with the activities he had pursued when he was alive. These objects included pottery, makeup and cosmetic equipment, jewelry, clothing, food and drink, tools, weapons, and toys and games. From them, we gain a great deal of information about everyday life and technology. The funerary objects also provide evidence of their religious beliefs and customs. By the Middle Kingdom, circa 1900 BCE, democratization of religious beliefs and practices meant that the range and quality of funerary goods for private as well as royal burials were greatly expanded. A major feature of the private tomb was the coffin or nest of coffins that housed the mummified body. These protected the body and also provided a surface on which magical spells, coffin texts, could be inscribed, to assist the passage of the deceased into the next world. There was often an outer, rectangular coffin which contained an anthropoid, body-shaped, coffin. Royalty and the great nobles were sometimes buried in stone coffins, but most examples were made of wood and, depending on their date, were painted either with geometric designs which represented the stylized facade of a palace or house, or with scenes featuring the gods. Some burials were also supplied with a wooden canopic chest which contained 4 pottery jars, canopic jars, in which the embalmers had placed the preserved viscera, abdominal and chest organs, removed from the body during mummification. From the Middle Kingdom onwards, a large variety of wooden models were also placed in the tombs. These frequently provided a 3-dimensional image of the subject matter represented in the wall scenes in the tombs. There were statuettes of the tomb owner because, if the mummy were destroyed, it was believed that these could function on his behalf to receive sustenance from the food offerings placed at the tomb. Sometimes there were also statuettes of other members of the family, and groups of servant models engaged in food production and preparation, in order that the deceased owner would be provided with adequate and eternal supplies of bread, beer, meat, fish, fowl and other delicacies. There were models of granaries, breweries, slaughterhouses, and peasants engaged in agricultural work, as well as of the owner's house and garden. Some tombs also included model soldiers to protect the deceased, and figurines of animals, musicians and concubines to entertain him. A special category of these models were the Ashabti, or Shabti, figures which, from the Middle Kingdom onwards, were placed in the tombs. These sets each contained hundreds of figurines, possibly one for each day of the year, plus an additional group of overseers to control the Ashabtis. They were provided to undertake the manual and agricultural tasks on behalf of their owner, when he entered the kingdom of Osiris, the realm of the dead. Tombs were also supplied with model boats. Sometimes, only one would be included, but wealthy people might have complete fleets. The main purpose of including a model boat was to allow the owner to travel to Abydos, the burial place of the god Osiris, so that he could enhance his chances of resurrection. However, some tombs included model boats for other purposes. There were funerary barks, long-distance boats for traveling on the Nile and fishing boats to supply food. Finally, tombs were also frequently equipped with soul houses. These pottery model houses had features which reflected contemporary domestic architecture, such as flat rooftops and open courtyards for cooking. In fact, they were provided to be used as offering trays in Middle Kingdom tombs. Food provisions were placed on them for the deceased as an alternative to the circular offering tables or rectangular slabs that had been used for that purpose in earlier periods, and from which the soul houses had evolved. Much of our information about the funerary customs is derived from the mummified body, and the bandages and protective items that were placed inside the wrappings, Smith 1991. These included the face mask, which was often made of cartonnage, a mixture of gum and linen or papyrus, which protected the face and also provided another lockers for the owner's spirit if the mummy and coffin had been destroyed. There were also chest and foot covers which provided protection for those parts of the mummy. The body was enclosed in many layers of linen bandages, between which were inserted the pieces of sacred jewelry, amulets, intended to provide magical and spiritual protection for the owner during his passage into the next world. Amulets are found in a variety of shapes and materials. Some represented gods, or sacred symbols or parts of the body, to attract good influences to help the deceased. One special category, scarabs, represented the dung beetle, which was regarded as a symbol of constant renewal of life. Mummification. Since the mid-19th century, the scientific study of Egyptian mummified human and animal remains has added considerably to our knowledge of mummification techniques and funerary practices, as well as disease patterns, diet and familial relationships. David 1999, 2000. These early investigations were important because they established that mummies could be studied scientifically instead of merely being regarded as curiosities, brought back as souvenirs to Europe and America by wealthy travelers who visited Egypt. Subsequently, scientists and scholars have built on this early research, and there have been radiological surveys of the royal mummies in Cairo, and detailed investigations of the bodies of individual rulers such as Ramesses II and Tutankhamun. Studies of mummies were greatly facilitated in the 20th century because of the expertise developed by various multidisciplinary teams who have access to a wide range of medical and scientific techniques. In addition, excavation has provided these scientists with a greatly expanded source of human and animal mummies on which to undertake their research. Since 1973, one team, the Manchester Egyptian Mummy Research Project, David 1979, has pioneered and developed a methodology for examining mummified remains which has been adopted by many other groups. One of the main aims of this project has been to discover evidence from the mummies about disease, diet and funerary practices. Various techniques have been employed, including radiology, histology, endoscopy, electron microscopy, serology, paleodontology and DNA studies. In 1995, the Manchester team established a joint project with the Egyptian Ministry of Health in Cairo to construct an epidemiological profile of one particular disease, schistosomiasis, by comparing its pattern in ancient and modern times. In order to obtain a wide range of tissue samples for this study, the world's first international ancient Egyptian mummy tissue bank has been set up at Manchester, to be used as a major resource for studies on this and other diseases. In order to detect if schistosomiasis is present in these minute tissue samples, one particular technique, immunocytochemistry, has been developed and used for the first time as a diagnostic tool in relation to mummified tissue. In addition to disease studies, this type of research augments knowledge about religious and funerary customs, and the mummification procedure itself. Scientific studies have been undertaken to investigate the use of natron, a naturally occurring chemical compound, found in one of Egypt's dry desert valleys, as a dehydrating agent in mummification, and radiology has proved to be a useful tool to examine the artifacts found inside the mummy bandages. Radiology can supply evidence about the historical and cultural context of each mummy. Radiographs will indicate if resin or natron have been used in the mummification process, and can demonstrate if amulets have been placed between the bandages that encase the mummy. Also, other details such as embalmers' restorations, false limbs, false eyes or subcutaneous packing to enhance the rounded, bodily shape of the mummy, may be detected, and it is usually possible to determine if, during the mummification process, the abdominal and thoracic cavities have been eviscerated and subsequently filled either with linen packages or the returned, mummified viscera. Generally, scientific studies on mummies add new facts to existing knowledge, and whereas archaeological or literary evidence may present a biased or incomplete picture of life in ancient Egypt, physical facts gleaned from this type of scientific research can provide a more balanced viewpoint. Religious paintings. During the period when Egypt was under Roman rule, after 30 BCE, evidence from some of the cemeteries indicates that foreign settlers, mainly Greeks and Romans, adopted Egyptian funerary practices. Bagnall 1993. They mummified their dead and encased them in bandages and cartonnage covers, but they now also incorporated panel portraits in the funerary headpiece. These portraits provide almost the only surviving evidence for the study of this type of ancient portrait painting, which must have existed in many other parts of the Roman Empire. However, in Egypt, the uniquely favorable environmental conditions and the adaptation of such paintings for funerary purposes ensured their survival here as nowhere else. Each probably represents a realistic likeness of the deceased, in whose lifetime the portrait may have been painted by an itinerant artist. As such, they provide a marked contrast to the earlier pharaonic art. The official, state art of pharaonic Egypt is a major source for the study of religion because it was almost completely interwoven with religious development. This art has survived because the tombs and temples were built of stone. Also, because religious concepts had inspired the form and decoration of these buildings, the scenes which cover the walls of tombs and temples preserve detailed information about rituals, mythology, beliefs and customs. Wall reliefs in the temples show the rites which were once performed in the various chambers and halls, Fig. 2.1, while mural paintings in the rock-cut tombs of the New Kingdom, which replaced pyramids as the architectural style for royal burials, depict representations from the magical funerary books. These were intended to secure a safe passage for the king when he traveled into the next world. Finally, in the private tombs, mural scenes which represented the daily activities which were once part of the tomb owner's life on earth were intended to enable him to continue these pleasures in the afterlife. Fig. 2.1. Temple wall relief of king presenting burning incense before the god, as part of the daily temple ritual. Religious literature. There is a more profound modern understanding of Egyptian civilization than of some other early societies because we have access to their ideas, thoughts and beliefs through an extensive religious and secular literature. Until Egyptian hieroglyphs were deciphered by the French scholar Champollion in the early 19th century, ancient Egypt was regarded as an awesome but mysterious civilization that had produced vast monuments, strange art forms and quaint religious beliefs and customs. Until then, knowledge of the civilization had rested on the accounts of classical writers such as Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, and all travelers and scholars in medieval and Renaissance times continued to rely substantially on these early writings. Ludicrous conclusions were frequently reached about the significance and meaning of monuments such as the pyramids, which some identified as Joseph's granaries or astronomical structures rather than burial places, or about the correct interpretation of hieroglyphs, which were merely regarded as magical symbols rather than as a writing system which conveyed the syntax, grammar and vocabulary of a language which had been spoken for over 3,000 years. However, once decipherment had enabled scholars to understand and translate the texts, a rich literary tradition was revealed. Archaeology can still only provide a limited and sometimes unbalanced view of a society, whereas literary sources can amplify and sometimes contradict the evidence of the monuments and artifacts. For example, the archaeological data from ancient Egypt give the impression that a belief in continued existence after death was universal and unchallenged, but some of the texts indicate that, in times of social collapse and upheaval, people questioned this certainty. Such writings emphasize the fact that, despite elaborate funerary preparations, no one had actually returned from the realm of the dead to confirm the reality of survival and eternity. The funerary texts. Some of the earliest and most important religious texts can be traced to the Old Kingdom. Towards the end of this period, dynasties 5 and 6, the king's pyramids were reduced in size and quality because of increasing religious and economic pressures. Instead of enjoying the apparent protection of great burial monuments, the kings now chose to rely increasingly on alternative, magical methods of securing their burials and ensuring that they could ascend to heaven where they would be received and accepted by the gods. The most important of these methods was the inclusion of a set of spells, carved on the walls inside the pyramid, Faulkner 1969. Known as the pyramid texts, these form the oldest substantial body of written religious material that has ever been discovered. The texts are inscribed on the interior walls of pyramids of dynasties 5, 6 and 7 at Saqqara. The first set was discovered by the French archaeologist Gaston Maspero in 1880. These spells were exclusively intended for royal use, to ensure that the king attained individual immortality, and there is no evidence that they were made available to commoners in the Old Kingdom. Intended to ensure the dead king's resurrection and ascent to heaven, and to confirm his survival and immortality, the texts refer to various means, wings, steps and ramps by which the king could reach the sky. For example, in Utterance, Spell, 267 it is stated, "A ramp to the sky is built for him, that he can go up to the sky on it. He goes up upon the incense. He flies as a bird, and he settles as a beetle on an empty seat that is in the ship of Re. With the democratization of religion in the Middle Kingdom, other religious inscriptions were developed for the use of non-royal owners. Known as the coffin texts, these spells were inscribed on the coffins, with the aim of assisting the owner to enter the hereafter. They also provided a menu of food and drink so that the owner would receive adequate spiritual sustenance after death. Faulkner 1973-8. One example from the tomb of two brothers at Rifa shows how such lists were organized. A boon which the king gives, to Osiris, lord of Busiris, the great god, lord of Abydos, in all his places, that he may give invocation offerings, consisting of bread and beer, oxen and fowl, alabaster, clothing and incense, all things good and pure on which a god lives, for the spirit of the revered Nektank, born of Knamea. During the New Kingdom, the function of the coffin texts was largely taken over by the so-called funerary books, the most famous of which is known as the Book of the Dead. The Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. The spells contained in these books included measures to ensure the resurrection of the deceased and his safety in the next world, and also represented various rituals enacted at the burial and in the subsequent cult. Scenes and inscriptions from these books were used to decorate the interior walls of the rock-cut royal tombs of this period, and were written on papyrus scrolls which could be purchased and placed in the tombs of non-royal owners. Mythology. Egyptian literature includes a wealth of mythological texts, of which the cosmogonies, creation myths, and the myth of Osiris are amongst the most significant. The Egyptians believed that creation had been brought about through divine thoughts and words. During the Old Kingdom, when the priests attempted to rationalize the worship of a multiplicity of gods whose cults had come into existence in earlier times, they arranged them into groups or families. Many now had cult centers, and a few cities became places of great religious importance where powerful priesthoods promoted the cults of particular gods, and developed individual theologies. Each of these included a mythological explanation of how the cult center's chief god had played a primary role in creating the universe, other deities and mankind. The most important creation myths were established at Heliopolis, the ancient Egyptian IW, Memphis and Hermopolis, and later, in the New Kingdom, the creator role of the god Amun was developed at Thebes. The myths had some common, underlying concepts, such as the belief that creation had occurred on a primordial mound or island that had emerged from the primeval ocean. Each priesthood claimed that the temple of its own god was the location of that actual primeval mound, and so every temple in Egypt came to be regarded as the original island of creation. As such, each temple was a place of great spiritual potency where the king or his delegate, the high priest, could approach the gods to seek benefits for mankind. The myth of Osiris explains the background to the success of one of Egypt's greatest deities, Griffiths 1980. Although there are many references to Osiris and his cult in the Egyptian texts, there is no extant account of his myth, and the earliest, and most complete version, entitled De Isidit Osiride, is preserved in Greek in the writings of Plutarch, 50–120 CE. It describes how Osiris ruled Egypt as an early king and brought the people the benefits of civilization and agriculture. However, because of the jealousy of his brother Seth, Osiris was murdered, his body was dismembered, and the parts were scattered throughout Egypt. After Isis, his sister wife, had subsequently gathered together his limbs and restored his body, she posthumously conceived his child, Horus, who grew up to avenge his father's death by fighting Seth. A tribunal of gods finally judged the dispute, and found in favor of Osiris and Horus, with the result that Osiris was resurrected and became the ruler of every living thing on earth, with whom every king of Egypt was identified, while Seth was personified as evil and became an outcast. This mythology was the source from which Osiris' roles developed as god and judge of the dead, expressing his victory over evil and death, and enabling him to promise eternal life to his followers. The wisdom literature. This major literary genre, which first developed in the Old Kingdom and continued until the late period, provides the earliest written evidence of a code of morals and ethics which expressed a close relationship between the gods and non-royal people. Lichtheim 1973, 1976. Their instructions in wisdom, which had been authorized by the gods, provided a set of rules and a code of behavior which were taught to young boys. Usually presented in the form of an address from a wise elder, the king, first minister or father, to his charges, the texts gave advice on how to advance in society. They were copied as model writing exercises by generations of schoolboys, and emphasized such values as kindness, moderation, and the ability to exercise good judgment, as well as practical attributes such as polite behavior at table and in other people's houses. For example, do not exalt someone of noble birth more than you do the child of a humble man, but choose a man because of his actions. The instruction addressed to Merikere. If you are a guest at the table of one greater than you, take what he gives as it is set before you. Look at what is before you. Don't speak until he addresses you. One does not know what may cause offense. The instruction of Ptahhotep. Although originally intended as a code of behavior for the upper classes and a training for future courtiers and officials, in later times the instructions were developed to include and address the educational needs of middle-class children. The pessimistic literature. This particular term is used for a genre of literature which provides a very different insight into the Egyptians' attitudes towards life and death. Lichtheim 1973, 1976. Instead of the confidence exemplified by the funerary monuments and burial goods, these texts question the certainty of immortality and an individual hereafter. In some examples, the author examines social and religious concepts against the general historical background of the period, and in two famous examples, the prophecy of Nefertiti and the admonitions of a prophet, the texts may well describe the appalling social conditions which occurred as a result of the collapse of centralized government from the end of the Old Kingdom through to the First Intermediate Period. I will show you the land in lamentation and distress. That which has never happened before has come to pass. Men will take up weapons of warfare. The land will live in uproar. Prophecy of Nefertiti. In another example, death is seen as the only solution to the agony brought about by social collapse. Lo, great and small say I wish I were dead. Little children say he should never have caused me to live. Lo, children of princes are dashed against walls. Infants are put on the high ground. Admonitions of a prophet. In other texts, an individual crisis, perhaps brought about by social and economic upheaval in the country, sets the background for the author to describe personal doubt and despair. One unique text, the dispute between a man and his soul, which is regarded as a masterpiece in the literature of the ancient world, takes the form of a dialogue between a man and his soul, and addresses the man's fears and self-doubts. Driven to despair by personal problems and by the social catastrophe of his times, the man longs for death and possibly even contemplates suicide. Death is before me today, as the fragrance of myrrh. As when one sits under sail on a breezy day. Death is before me today, as when a man longs to see his home, when he has spent many years in captivity. However, his soul, described as a separate entity, strongly opposes this stance, and eventually persuades the man to continue his life to its natural end so that they can eventually share a properly prepared tomb throughout eternity. This is what my soul said to me: throw aside lamentation, my comrade, my brother. I will stay here if you reject the West. But when you arrive in the West, and your body is reunited with the earth, then I will alight after you rest, and then we shall dwell together. This profound pessimism, probably generated by the complete collapse of the society at the end of the Old Kingdom, also influenced some of the later funerary hymns or songs which came to form part of the burial service in the Middle and New Kingdoms. These hymns were intended to reassure the deceased tomb owner and assert the joys of eternal life, but one version, exemplified by the song in the tomb of Intef, now encouraged the owner to enjoy life while he could, emphasizing its ephemeral nature and the uncertainty of immortality. The gods who were before rest in their tombs. The blessed nobles too are buried in their tombs. Those who built tombs. Their places are no more. What has become of them? Other hymns, such as the song from the tomb of Neferhotep, were later introduced to attempt to counteract the skepticism expressed in the Intef song, and to reassure the tomb owner of the validity of a continued belief in the afterlife. Both hymns continued to be used in the tombs, expressing two different viewpoints and underlining the fact that there was no conclusive or satisfactory answer to the questions relating to eternity and the deceased's attainment of immortality. The pessimistic texts are important because they provide a marked contrast to the archaeological evidence, which stresses certainty in a belief in an afterlife, and also because they represent an invaluable insight into the Egyptians' unresolved self-doubts. Historical overview. Sources. The history of ancient Egyptian civilization covers the period from circa 3100 BCE to Alexander the Great's conquest of the country in 332 BCE. Before this dynastic period, scattered communities had gradually come together to form two kingdoms. Today, this span, circa 5000 to 3100 BCE, is known as the predynastic period. After Alexander's conquest in 332 BCE, a line of Macedonian Greeks, the Ptolemies, ruled Egypt. They were descended from Alexander's general, Ptolemy, who became Ptolemy I. With the death of Cleopatra VII, last of this dynasty, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire in 30 BCE, and was subsequently ruled from Rome as a province. The modern chronology of Egypt is based on the writings of an Egyptian priest, Manetho, 323 to 245 BCE, who compiled a chronicle of Egyptian kings who ruled between circa 3100 BCE and 332 BCE, dividing his king list into dynasties. Although Manetho's records are sometimes unreliable and inaccurate, and have only survived in later sources which include Josephus, Eusebius and Africanus, Egyptologists have accepted his division of reigns into 30 dynasties. A later chronographer added a 31st dynasty. In addition to Manetho's chronicle, several Egyptian king lists have survived that preserve partial or damaged evidence about Egyptian chronology. Most of these were inscribed on temple walls, where they formed a key feature in the ritual performed daily in royal cult complexes to honor previous rulers and gain their acceptance for the present king. As such, these were never intended as historical records. They are incomplete and include only the names of rulers who were deemed to be legitimate, and had reigned during the period between the reign of the first king and that of the ruler who commissioned the list. The predynastic period, c. 5000 c. 3100 BCE. After circa 3400 BCE, the scattered communities who had settled in the Delta and the Nile Valley evolved into two distinct kingdoms. The Northern Kingdom, the Red Land, was situated in the Delta and the northernmost part of the Nile Valley, while its southern counterpart, the White Land, occupied the Delta and the rest of the Nile Valley within Egypt. One theory, now largely discounted, claimed that it was the arrival in Egypt of a new group of people, the so-called dynastic race, which led to the first appearance of writing, monumental brick architecture, and the advances in arts and crafts that occurred in circa 3400 BCE. But a more recent proposal suggests that these advances were the sole achievements of the indigenous population, which owed nothing to any external influence. However these changes may have originated, it is evident that advances were made in technology and building techniques, and that both kingdoms shared many features of a common culture. At this period there is already evidence of the social and religious customs which would later develop in the dynastic period. Our belief in continued existence after death for the individual is apparent in the burial preparations, and there was already a well-established tradition of animal cults. We can also observe the process of syncretism, where the multitude of deities worshipped by the many local communities either merged to create one deity with a range of attributes, or became a family group of gods. Thus, as the villages and towns were amalgamated into larger social and political units, this process was reflected in the corresponding religious developments. The Archaic period, c. 3100 c. 2686 BCE. As the southern rulers ultimately set out to conquer the northern kingdom, one king, Scorpion, made some military advances, but it was the ruler named Mens in classical sources, either Nama or Hoaha, who finally defeated the North in circa 3100 BCE and unified the two kingdoms under his rulership. The rulers of this dynasty moved the capital city to Memphis, at the apex of the delta, and during the first two dynasties they ruled a unified state. They laid the foundations for the political, social and religious organization of the country, and established avenues of national and local government. This period of peace and stability enabled the resources of the country to be focused on the advancement of technology and the arts and crafts. Substantial funerary monuments, brick-built mastaba constructed to house the burials of the royal family and nobility, are one example of this policy. The Old Kingdom, c. 2686, c. 2181 BCE. The mastaba were retained for the wealthy classes throughout the Old Kingdom, and most of the population were buried in shallow desert graves. Fig. 2.2. A reconstruction of the Dynasty 5 pyramids at Abu Sir, adapted from L. Borchardt, Das Grabdenkmal des Königs Eni, Plate 1, showing the main elements of a pyramid complex, as exemplified by that of Niuser, 1. Valley building, 2. Causeway, 3. Mortuary temple, 4. Pyramid and Sun Temple, 5. Temple of Niuser. As they had been since predynastic times, but early in the Old Kingdom, the pyramid was introduced for royal burials, epitomizing the first great period of Egyptian civilization and the gulf between ruler and ruled. Imhotep, the vizier and architect of Djoser who ruled in Dynasty 3, built the first pyramid at Saqqara. This was designed as a stepped structure, and was part of an elaborate burial and mortuary complex. There then followed a period of experimentation, but by Dynasty 4 the true pyramid, featuring smooth, sloping sides, had emerged. These pyramids reached their zenith at Giza, where the famous burial sites of the kings Cheops, Chephren and Mycerinus were built. These monuments, and the nobles' mastaba that surrounded them, were constructed of stone to last for eternity. The pyramid was probably intended not only to protect the king's body and funerary goods, but also to provide him with a magical ramp which could be used to gain access to the heavens. The pyramid form may have represented a sun ray, and was probably closely associated with the cult of the sun god Re. However, by Dynasty 5, the construction and maintenance of the pyramid complexes, and the employment of priests and other staff to service them, had become an economic burden on the royal resources, see Figs 2.2 and 2.3. Also, Fig 2.3. Plan of the pyramid complex of Sahor, Dynasty 5, at Abu Sir. Adapted from L. Borchardt, Das Grabdenkmal des Königs Eni, Volume 1, Plate 16. As the power of the kings began to decline, the sun cult became increasingly important, with the result that resources were now directed towards building new sun temples, whereas the size and quality of the pyramids were reduced. Subsequently, the kings sought another means of securing their eternal life by inscribing magical spells, the pyramid texts, on the interior walls of their pyramids. Throughout Dynasty 6, the power of the king and of the centralized bureaucracy steadily declined, exacerbated by economic, political, religious and social factors. The long reign of Pepi II brought the dynasty to an end, and in the following years there was a period of anarchy when centralized government collapsed and Egypt returned to the political conditions of early predynastic times when local rulers wielded power in their districts and fought against each other. The stability of the Old Kingdom had allowed art, religion and literature to flourish, and the lavish funerary equipment placed in the tombs and the registers of scenes painted on the interior walls of the mastabas provide an indication of the quality of everyday existence for the wealthy and those who served them. The literature that has survived includes not only historical, religious and legal texts, but also an important didactic source, the wisdom texts, which provides insight into moral and ethical values. The First Intermediate Period, c. 2181 c. 1991 BCE. During this time of decentralization and anarchy, all the values of the Old Kingdom were overturned. Internal political and social collapse was probably exacerbated by the external threat of Bedouin raids and incursions, and many monuments and graves were desecrated and robbed. The countryside was gradually overwhelmed by poverty, famine and disease. The effect of this upon the population and on individuals is probably recalled in a collection of literary works that is now known as the pessimistic literature. This upheaval only drew to a close when a line of local princes at Thebes who carried the family name Mentuhotep were able to exert their power and establish Dynasty 11. They restored some order to Egypt, and arts and crafts again enjoyed a revival. Throughout this period, the power of Memphis, the Old Kingdom capital, had disappeared, the political institutions were no longer centralized there, and the city had ceased to accommodate the major concentration of craftsmen. Instead, provincial rulers were buried in rock-cut tombs in the cliffs along the river, which were decorated with painted wall scenes and equipped with the tomb goods made by local artists and craftsmen. When the Mentuhotep family seized overall control, it was their own city of Thebes that flourished as the capital, and a new art style emerged as a result of the goods produced there by local artisans. The Middle Kingdom, 1991 to 1786 BCE. At the beginning of Dynasty 12, a commoner, Amenemhet, seized the throne. He was probably the first minister of the last king of Dynasty 11, whom he assassinated. Amenemhet inaugurated another period of great prosperity. He moved the capital north to Lisht, and he and his descendants re-established a firm system of government. Because this dynasty had no royal antecedents, it was necessary to establish an uncontested succession, and thus these kings introduced the concept of co-regency, when the chosen heir joined the king as co-ruler. They also developed positive external policies, restoring dominion over Nubia to the south, by building a string of garrisoned fortresses, and also fostering trading contacts with the Aegean Islands, and with the inhabitants of Byblos, on the Syrian coast, and Punt, which had access to the Red Sea coast. Now, the king no longer held the supreme power he had theoretically enjoyed in the Old Kingdom, and also the royal patron god of the Old Kingdom, did not retain his unrivaled position. Following the collapse of divine and royal power at the end of the Old Kingdom, a new, democratic concept of the afterlife emerged, and the belief that only the king could experience an individual eternity was replaced by the idea that immortality would be available to all believers who could demonstrate pious and worthy lives. This concept was closely associated with the worship of the god Osiris, and it profoundly affected religious beliefs and customs, and funerary practices. The kings continued to be buried in pyramids, but many provincial governors built rock-cut tombs in their own districts in preference to the mastaba tombs which surrounded the royal burial site. The Second Intermediate Period, 1786 to 1567 BCE. This period, which consists of 5 dynasties, was again characterized by decentralization and decline. Some dynasties with lines of native rulers were contemporary, but in dynasties 15 and 16 a group of foreign conquerors known as the Hyksos entered Egypt and established themselves as rulers over much of the country. The native princes of Thebes, who formed Dynasty 17, eventually drove the Hyksos out of Egypt into southern Palestine, and then established themselves as the founders of Dynasty 18 and the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom, 1567 to 1085 BCE. The Hyksos invasion profoundly influenced and changed the Egyptians' attitude towards foreign policy and colonization. Instead of contact with other countries through trade, they now adopted an aggressive policy, particularly towards Syria-Palestine, in order to prevent any further attempted invasion of Egypt. The New Kingdom therefore became the period of Egypt's empire, when a succession of kings sought to subdue the minor states in Palestine and bring them under. Fig. 2.4. Plan of Temple of Amenri at Karnak, New Kingdom, showing main elements of a typical cultus temple. 1. Pylon, 2. Outer court, 3. Hypostyle hall, 4. Sanctuary. Adapted from 8th Erman, Life in Egypt, trans. H. M. Tirard, 1971, p. 280. Their own influence. This policy brought Egypt into major conflict with other great powers of the area, the Mitannians and the Hittites, but at its zenith Egypt was able to create and govern the world's first empire, which stretched from the river Euphrates in the north to Nubia in the south. These military expeditions brought extensive booty back to Egypt, and Amenri, the great state god and royal patron of this period, was the major recipient of this vast wealth. Fig. 2.4. Originally the local, family god of the princes of Thebes, in the New Kingdom Amun adopted the additional characteristics of the sun god Re and, as Amenri, became the supreme god of Egypt and its empire in Dynasty 18. However, the god's priesthood at his main temple at Karnak soon acquired such wealth and power that they posed a threat to the king himself, and towards the end of Dynasty 18, in the so-called Amarna period, King Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, took unprecedented and ultimately unsuccessful measures to try to curtail this power. Throughout the New Kingdom, apart from the reign of Amenhotep IV, Egypt's main religious center was Thebes. By now, the kings had abandoned the pyramid as a burial place and chose instead to be interred in rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the river, opposite Thebes. The town of the royal necropolis workmen, known today as Deir el-Medina, has provided a wealth of evidence from the archaeological remains and documents discovered in the rubbish heaps, and this has supplied details about their everyday lives, religious customs and working conditions. The Third Intermediate Period, 1085 to 668 BCE. Egypt fought successfully against the Hittites in Dynasty 19. They also faced new enemies such as the Libyan tribes who threatened their western front, and the coalitions of sea peoples who attacked the delta in Dynasties 19 and 20, in their search for new homelands. By Dynasty 21, Egypt's slow but inevitable decline had already begun. The kingdom was now effectively divided, with the kings ruling the north from the city of Tanis while a line of high priests of Amun controlled the south around Thebes. At Tanis, the royal tombs and treasure discovered by French archaeologists demonstrated the wealth of the rulers even in this period of decline. In Dynasties 22 and 23, rulers of Libyan descent, whose forebears had settled in the delta, briefly reunited the country, but in Dynasty 25 another line of foreign kings emerged who had originated in a kingdom, Kush, which lay to the south of Egypt. However, although they briefly gained control, they were eventually driven back to their homeland by the Assyrians who invaded Egypt from the north. The Late Period, 664 to 332 BCE. After a brief occupation by the Assyrians, another native Egyptian line, Dynasty 26, emerged at Sais in the delta. There was a short resurgence of former glory, with renewed nationalism and interest in earlier religious and literary beliefs and forms, but soon Egypt was once again under foreign domination, when she became part of the Persian Empire and was ruled as a Persian satrapy, possession, during Dynasties 27 and 31. The overall influence of Assyria and Persia on Egyptian institutions and beliefs was probably minimal, but following the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, ruler of Macedon, in 332 BCE, profound changes were introduced, first by the Ptolemies and then by the Roman rulers who became the absolute governors of the country and its people. The Greek and Roman rulers nevertheless recognized the need to be regarded as the legitimate rulers of Egypt, in order that they could exploit the economic and political powers this bestowed, and so they were careful to support the traditional state religion by building and restoring the major temples dedicated to the Egyptian gods. There was also a degree of syncretism between Egyptian and Greek religious beliefs and customs, especially in relation to funerary practices, and the state cult of the god Serapis attempted to fuse Egyptian and Greek traditions. However, the general practice was for Greeks and Egyptians to pursue their own separate religious beliefs. The political and social context. In the predynastic period, the communities scattered throughout the delta and along the Nile Valley were governed by local chieftains. These communities were gradually amalgamated into larger units, either because of the need for mutual cooperation or because one ruler conquered other leaders. This gave the overall community greater protection and enabled cooperation to be developed for schemes of mutual benefit such as irrigation. Nevertheless, each unit remained politically and socially independent and was governed by a chieftain who lived in the main town. The community was supported by the adjacent land. Antim, These larger units were themselves drawn into districts which became the nomes or administrative divisions in later periods. In circa 3400 BCE, two kingdoms came into existence, into which these larger units were now incorporated. The Red Land in the north and the White Land in the south each had its own king, capital city and patron deity. Eventually, in circa 3100 BCE, when the ruler of the White Land conquered the north and unified the country, he established a dynasty which governed the whole of Egypt, Emery 1961, 38-47. Despite this unification, the dualism of the two lands remained an important concept throughout pharaonic times, and was retained both as a basis for administering the country and as a strong element in religious symbolism. During the subsequent Archaic period, dynasties 1 and 2, an Old Kingdom, dynasties 3 to 6, the social structure became firmly established, and this continued, with minor adjustments, until the Greco-Roman era, when the Ptolemies and the Romans introduced their own systems. The central feature of pharaonic political and religious development was the concept of divine kingship. The Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was the king of Egypt. The title was derived from the hieroglyphic phrase Peye, which literally meant the great house. This was the term used for the palace, and was consequently applied to identify the king himself. The pharaoh was regarded as partly divine and, at least in theory, he was an absolute monarch, O'Connor and Silverman 1995. His role and duties had developed out of those of the early local chieftains, and he was expected to fulfill political, religious, social, military, economic and legal commitments, although in time many of these were delegated to royal officials. As early as the Archaic period, the king was identified with the royal hawk god Horus. Throughout his reign, the king was regarded as the incarnation of the god on earth, and after death, when he became Osiris, the divine father of Horus, the Horus title was then passed on to his successor. One theory, although now disputed, is that succession to the kingship passed through the female line, and each king was considered to be the offspring of the chief state god and the previous king's principal queen. As the son of the god on earth, the king certainly had a unique status which not only emphasized the great divide between himself and his subjects, but also gave him special powers to intercede between gods and mankind. For example, he was responsible for founding and provisioning the temples, and for performing the temple rituals for the gods. In return, he received the kingship from the gods, and had theoretical ownership of the land, its resources and its people. He could dispose of these as he wished, but his actions were subject to the principles of the goddess Maat, who personified divine balance and order throughout the universe. In practice, he was to a large extent advised and controlled by his counselors and administrators. The coronation ceremony was believed to endow the king with the necessary divine and royal powers to make him an effective ruler, and these were renewed periodically at Jubilee festivals. As a reward for his attention to the gods, the king was assured military supremacy over his enemies, and peace and prosperity for his people. His semi-divine nature also ensured that he would achieve individual immortality after death. In the Old Kingdom, this was a key difference between the king and his subjects, who could only hope for continued existence through their role in assisting the king. Even when religious beliefs became more democratic in the Middle Kingdom, and all believers could expect individual eternity, the king's hereafter differed from that of his subjects. Whereas non-royal persons could expect to pass their eternity in the tomb and in the underworld realm of Osiris, the king would sail in the divine bark, in the company of the gods, forever encircling the heavens. The queens also played an important part in the royal succession. In the early Old Kingdom and at different periods in Egypt's later history, it was customary for the royal heir to marry his own sister, the great royal daughter, who was the child of the ruling king and his principal queen, great royal wife, but sometimes this did not happen, perhaps because the royal couple did not have a son and daughter who could marry each other. Since the kings were polygamous and there were secondary branches of the family from these minor wives, there was sometimes rivalry and the succession was disputed. The nobility and officials. In the early Old Kingdom, the nobility consisted of members of the royal family. The king attempted to gain the allegiance of his relatives by granting them the most important positions in the government, and by giving them gifts of royal land and possessions, as well as tombs, burial goods and estates to provide income for the perpetual upkeep of the tombs. However, by the end of the Old Kingdom, the governorships and top administrative posts were increasingly allocated to people outside the royal family, whose support the king now wished to gain. The country was ruled through a system of local governors who controlled the administrative districts, and were responsible to the king, through his first minister. This man was effectively the king's deputy, acting as head of the judiciary, chief royal architect and keeper of the state archives. At first, the local governorships had been non-hereditary, to ensure that the king could limit these powers and control the men's actions, but increasingly, the positions became hereditary, a favor bestowed by the king in order to gain the governor's support, and when the centralized administration was weak, the local governors were able to seize considerable powers and become virtually independent of the king. This happened during the first intermediate period, and even in the early Middle Kingdom the kings needed the governors' support because of their own tenuous right to rule. In the later Middle Kingdom, the political power of the provincial governors seems to disappear, together with their rights and privileges. They were replaced as administrators by a new middle class drawn from the small farmers, craftsmen and tradesmen, and these officials were now directly responsible to the king or first minister. The nobles had posed a real threat to royal supremacy since the middle of the Old Kingdom. As his own power waned, this decline in royal supremacy was exacerbated by the king's attempts to gain the nobles' favor and support, by lavishing land and wealth on them. The result, however, was that his own position declined, while the nobles exploited their increased independence. The other threat to the king's supremacy came from the priests, but the king was never able effectively to quell their power, and they remained a formidable force. The officials who supported the government bureaucracy formed an extensive hierarchy who ran the treasury, armory, granaries and public works. These departments were accommodated within the precinct of the palace in the capital city. This complex also included one of the main residences of the royal family. As well as the centralized bureaucracy, there were also local government departments in the provincial districts. The royal burial area, with its associated temples and cities where the mortuary priests and workers lived, was supervised by its own administration. Craftsmen and peasants. Below the extensive bureaucracy of officials, there were the artisans and craftsmen. Their most important duties revolved around the production of goods for the tombs. They were mainly organized into communal workshops where associated crafts were practiced alongside each other. The capital city was the main center of activity for these workers, although there were workshops in other towns and localities which each produced its own distinctive style of goods. In some periods, significant schools of art developed in, for example, Memphis and Thebes, where the sculpture and painting exhibited some quite distinctive features, such as the elongated, slender forms of the human figures seen in the Theban style, although in general all works followed the prescribed format for religious art. Some of the larger temples had their own workshops where the ritual objects used in temple worship were produced. The best artisans were engaged to prepare, decorate and equip the royal tombs. They were housed in purpose-built towns near to the burial site, and some of these, discovered at Giza, Edwards 1985, 282-4, Cahoon, David 1997, Tel El Amarna and Deir El Medina, near Thebes, and 1973, have been excavated. The objects and papyri found at these sites have provided a wealth of information about the living conditions and terms of employment of the royal workmen. The craftsmen made advances in many branches of technology, specifically to improve tomb architecture and tomb goods such as coffins, furniture, clothing, jewelry, pottery and toiletries, but from earliest times they were able to expand this knowledge and expertise to produce domestic and luxury items for the living. Although the craftsmen were responsible for the skilled work on the tombs, Egypt also required a substantial laboring workforce who could be used at the building sites, to mine gold and to quarry stone. This labor force was drawn largely from the serfs or peasants who comprised perhaps 80% of the population. For much of the year, they worked on the land and produced the food for the whole population. However, They could also be called upon to undertake special tasks for the king, corvée duty. In fact, all subjects, regardless of status, were liable for this duty, but wealthier individuals paid substitutes to undertake the obligation on their behalf. Until a professional army was established in the New Kingdom, the peasants were used by the nobles to fight as soldiers in any military ventures in which the king wished to engage. The peasants also worked in the labor gangs at the royal building sites, particularly during the 3 months of each year when the inundation flooded the land and made cultivation impossible. In this way, the peasants could be continuously employed, food payments made to them and their families prevented starvation, and their time and efforts were concentrated so that they did not have the opportunity to foment rebellion. During the period of their employment on the land, they produced enough food to meet their own needs. They were also heavily taxed in kind, and this food provided daily sustenance for the whole population and also offerings for the rituals in the tombs and the temples. Egypt's neighbors. Egypt had little interest in the exploration of lands beyond its borders, except when it was necessary for commercial or trading ventures, or to establish military control over peoples who might otherwise attempt invasion. From earliest times, the Egyptians maintained trading contacts with Byblos on the Syrian coast, to obtain high-quality timber from the hinterland, which Egypt itself lacked. There were also expeditions to Punt, an unidentified region which lay somewhere near the west coast of the Red Sea, in order to trade for myrrh and incense which the Egyptians required for their religious rituals. To the south, they traveled to Nubia, the region which today straddles northern Sudan and southern Egypt, to acquire the granite for their monuments, and also gold, semi-precious stones, and exotic goods such as ivory and ebony from the far south. There were other trading connections with northern neighbors, including Crete and the Aegean Islands. Egypt's contacts with these regions were generally peaceful, but they maintained access to Nubia with the support of military operations. By contrast, their relations with their northern neighbors were primarily diplomatic and commercial until, in the New Kingdom, they began to build and consolidate an empire which at its height stretched as far as northern Syria. This aggressive policy was introduced to counteract any renewed attempt by foreigners to invade and rule Egypt, after they had expelled the Hyksos, a line of foreign dynasts, in circa 1560 BCE. The Egyptians were the first people to establish an empire, loosely based on a confederation of vassal city-states in Syria-Palestine. It was relatively benign and tolerant, particularly with regard to religious beliefs. Nevertheless, the pharaohs led regular campaigns throughout the New Kingdom to reassert their control, and from the Middle Kingdom, prisoners of war were brought back to Egypt where they were employed in a number of ways including domestic service and work on building sites. The role of religion in education, law and medicine. Religion permeated every aspect of life. Many of the functions of the temples were performed by lay priests who spent 3 months each year in the temples, and the remainder of the time pursuing their careers as scribes, lawyers or doctors. The scribes, educated men, were responsible to the god Thoth, who had invented writing and was in charge of numbers and the divisions of time. Scribes kept accounts and army records, collected taxes and controlled the law courts, but, most importantly, they composed and copied religious texts in the temple scriptoria, and some held priesthoods and taught students. Education involved training of the character as well as the mind, a concept which is made clear in the wisdom texts and other moral compositions that schoolboys were expected to copy out. Religion also played a vital role in the legal system. It was believed that law had been given to mankind at the time of creation, and Ma'at, who represented truth, righteousness and justice, and the equilibrium of the universe, was the patron goddess of lawyers. The officials of the judiciary were the priests of Ma'at. Some aspects of the legal system, such as the practice of obtaining a verdict by means of an oracle when a god statue acted as judge, emphasized the influence of religion on the law. Egyptian medicine contained a mixture of magico-religious and rational treatments which were regarded as equally valid. Specialist doctors were priests of the goddess Sekhmet, and Imhotep, the first minister of Dosra and architect of the step pyramid at Saqqara, was revered as a great physician and the founder of medical science in Egypt. He was later worshipped as god of medicine and healing. Some temples were renowned as centers of healing, long before this became a feature of the Greek tradition. In a sanatorium attached to the temple of Athor at Dendera, the mentally ill were accommodated and treated with a form of hypnotic therapy. Temples were also centers where medical training was provided for students. Religious beliefs and practices. State religion. Religion permeated most aspects of life and death in ancient Egypt. It was practiced at state level. The temples were a key feature and the king had an important role as the essential link between gods and men. Even in the predynastic period, the living had performed religious rites, but the gods' shrines, constructed of perishable materials, have not survived. The only evidence of them is provided in scenes painted on pottery placed in the graves, and in representations carved on cylinder seals and ebony and ivory tablets. However, in the later periods, stone-built temples provide information about the state cult and rituals. The temples. Initially, two types of temple developed in ancient Egypt. Solar, sun, temples occurred in dynasties 5 and 18, and were directly associated with the worship of the sun god. In Dynasty 5, when the priests of Re, the sun god, wielded unprecedented power, the kings built 6 sun temples at Abu Ghurab. These were modeled on the original sun temple at Heliopolis, which has never been discovered. Towards the end of Dynasty 18, during the Amarna period, special temples were built at Amarna, Thebes and elsewhere for the cult of the Aten, sun's disk. The solar temple tradition may have been introduced into Egypt from elsewhere, but the royal cult complexes and divine cult complexes built in the New Kingdom and later periods were both derived from the predynastic local shrines where community leaders, on behalf of the people, had presented offerings before the resident cult statues. Eventually, when the Egyptians developed their skills in stone masonry, the fragile construction of the early shrines was replaced with the masonry of the large stone temples, but these monuments retained the same layout and features as the shrines. The most powerful predynastic local leader eventually became king of Egypt, and his local deity became the chief state god. In the temples, the king, or the high priest as his delegate, acted on behalf of his subjects by offering food and other requirements to the god's statue. This became the basis of the rituals performed in the temples, carried out for the benefit of the state. In return for these offerings, the god was expected to provide the king and his people with success in warfare and ample harvests and wealth. Fairman 1945. The royal cult and divine cult complexes were built to the same basic layout and had many architectural features in common, since many aspects of their rituals were similar. The divine cult complex was designed primarily to house and protect the god's statue, and had space and accommodation for the rituals which were performed for the resident deity. The royal cult complex included provision for the same rites to be performed for the resident god, but there were also locations where the dead, deified ruler who had built the temple was continuously worshipped and received offerings, and where, by means of ritual, he could approach all the previous legitimate kings in order to gain their acceptance and approval of his reign. David 1981. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the royal cult complex was attached to the pyramid, but when rulers began to construct rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings at Thebes in the New Kingdom, there was no space there to accommodate any adjacent temples, and so they were now designed as separate units, usually built on the plain between the river and the burial site. The divine cult complex provided regular sustenance and care for the resident deity through the daily temple ritual, and celebrated the major events of the god's life by the performance of festivals held on occasions throughout the year. This relationship between gods and men, expressed through the king's personal role, formed the basis of Egyptian society, and it was believed that neglect of these duties would bring disaster to Egypt. In the royal cult complexes, in addition to the daily divine ritual, the king's own acceptance and eternal status as a ruler even after death was ensured by the performance of the ritual of the royal ancestors. The form, layout and architectural features of these temples were established by exact ritual requirements and by the mythology on which the temples were based. The main mythological explanation of the temple was that it was the island of creation where life had first come into existence. It was also the mansion of the god where the god resided, and a microcosm of the universe. As the mansion of the god, the temple provided a place of shelter, protection and worship, and its design incorporated features found in domestic architecture such as a bedroom, the shrine, a reception area, the hypostyle halls, and storerooms. However, the house plan was modified to accommodate a central processional route. As the island of creation, the architectural features reflected and symbolically recreated the location and vegetation of the island, providing a place of great sanctity where the god could rest and be approached. Thus, the columns in the hypostyle halls, with their palmiform, lotiform or papyriform capitals and the frieze of plants carved on the bases of the walls, represented the island's vegetation, while the ceiling was decorated to reflect the sky above the island. The wall scenes inside the temples also had a special purpose, see Fig. 2.1. In some areas, they represented specific events in the history of the building such as its foundation or consecration, or in the reign of its royal founder, such as his coronation. However, in other areas, they precisely indicate the different rituals once performed in those parts of the building. Here, scenes are arranged in horizontal registers on the walls, and provide invaluable information about the sequence of the rites. They always show the king performing the ritual for the god, although usually this was actually undertaken by the high priest. In the accompanying inscriptions, the title of the rite and the conversation and speeches of the god and king are given. Because of the limitations of wall space, only a selection of the rites appear, chosen from the complete version of the ritual which was originally recorded on papyrus. Because of the strict mythological and ritual requirements, only minor variations occur in the design and decoration of all these extant complexes, even though they were built at different sites and dates from the New Kingdom onwards. Through the temples and their rituals, the Egyptians sought to use magic as a means of manipulating supernatural forces to influence events on a cosmic scale, and to maintain the balance and order of the universe, thus preventing the return of chaos. The temples, with their special architecture and ritual wall scenes, were regarded as potent locations where these spiritual and temporal aims could be achieved. The priesthood. The state and local gods had temples and priesthoods whose prime duty was to act as the servants of the god and thus acquire the ability to control the supernatural forces that created and maintained life, Sawn around 1980. It was believed that this gave the priests their supposed power to influence events in life and after death. The priests were therefore essentially state magicians, but they had no pastoral role and no duties to preach to the populace. In fact, the temples and their priesthoods played no direct part in the religious activities of the masses. The priests were functionaries who performed the rituals on behalf of the temple deities, and although it was expected that they would display desirable characteristics such as discretion, honesty and fairness, they were not expected to have a religious vocation. Indeed, candidates were usually attracted by the affluent lifestyle and prospects of career advancement that the priesthood offered. Sometimes, the priesthood passed down in the family, with the son inheriting his father's place, but on other occasions either high-level selections and promotions were made by the king, or a committee of priests would choose a candidate for a vacancy, or a position could be purchased by payment of a fee. Most temple priests were employed on a lay or part-time basis, although from the New Kingdom onwards larger temples were staffed with many permanent priests. The lay priests in each temple were organized into 4 groups to undertake the daily rituals. Each group consisted of the same number of priests who served a rotational term of duty of 1 month, repeated thrice yearly, with a free period of 3 months in between, when they pursued other careers, often as doctors, lawyers or scribes. They were allowed to marry, and lived outside the temple enclosure when they were not on duty. During their term in the temple, they were required to observe certain taboos regarding food, clothing, worship and sexual abstinence, so that their physical and spiritual purity was ensured when they came in contact with the god's statue or his cult possessions. In the great temples, there were established hierarchies of priests. The high priest of Amun at Karnak had extensive political power because he could confer or withhold the god's approval of the royal heir, thus effectively controlling dynastic power. The top priests also advised the king on temple taxation, revenues and building plans, and wielded real political power. The temples also employed lay workers such as clerks, overseers of the estates that the temples owned, and butchers, bakers and florists who prepared the divine offerings. According to one record, the Temple of Karnak employed a total of 80,000 people. In addition to performing the rituals and educating their students, an important duty of the priests was to compose and copy the sacred texts to perpetuate the divine cult. These specialist priests, who worked in an area of the temple known as the House of Life, would discuss and develop the gods' mythology and theology, and prepare religious, astronomical and medical texts. Each temple may have been aligned towards a star that was linked to the mythology of the resident deity. However, although the Egyptians made many astronomical observations, they retained the belief that the Earth was flat and suspended in the midst of a circular ocean, the upper half of which represented the sky while the lower half was the location of the underworld where the dead dwelt. The gods. The Egyptian pantheon embraced hundreds of deities whom, on the basis of each god's role and characteristics, Egyptologists have classified under the three main categories of state, local and household gods, Morenz 1973. Originally, in predynastic times, each local community had its own deity, but with the political amalgamation of villages into districts and ultimately into a nation-state, the main gods of the communities were transformed into district gods, and in some cases into deities of national importance and influence. These became state gods who were worshipped throughout Egypt, although they often retained a strong connection with a particular city or site. The country's external and internal success was accredited to their influence and support, and in each dynasty the rulers would select a particular god as their own royal patron and protector. Some gods, such as the creator gods Re, whose first center was at Heliopolis, or Amun, the chief god of Thebes, were continuously included amongst the state gods and were generally worshipped as supreme deities, but in several dynasties the rulers would elevate their own local god as the dynasty's royal patron so that the god acquired a temporary status as a state deity. The gods in this top league usually had temples and cults and were served by their own priesthoods. Briefly, at the end of Dynasty 18, King Akhenaten elevated the cult of the Aten, sun's disk, to an unprecedented form of monotheism, Aldred 1988. Some of the state gods formed family groups, such as the Triad of Amun, his wife Mut and his son Khonsu at Thebes, and the Ennead, 9 gods, at Heliopolis which included Re. The Osirian Triad, Osiris, his wife Isis and his son Horus, was uniquely important, although the worship of Osiris focused on his role as a god of the dead, unlike the other deities who were gods of the living, Griffiths 1980. Although the two centers associated with Osiris, Abydos and Busiris, were great centers of pilgrimage, Osiris did not possess his own temple and priesthood, but was accommodated in the shrines of other gods. The local gods, although they possessed temples and priesthoods at particular sites, never attained permanent national importance, although they continued to be worshipped over many centuries and exerted considerable local influence. Some deities were worshipped at shrines in the houses and did not receive any temple cults, Urn 1973. Today, these are termed household gods, and they played a very important role in the personal religion of the ancient Egyptians. People of all classes addressed their requests and prayers to these gods, rather than to the temple deities, although Amun appears to have had a dual role as both the nation's supreme god and the personal deity of the royal necropolis workforce at Deir el-Medina. The household gods most widely worshipped were Bez, a dwarf god with special responsibility for marriage and jollification, and his consort Tawat, a hippopotamus goddess who assisted women in childbirth. Some gods had special roles. Seth, the wicked brother of Osiris who murdered him and subsequently fought Osiris' son Horus, was found guilty by the divine tribunal in the myth of Osiris. Consequently, he became an outcast, and the personification of evil, the devil of the Egyptian pantheon. Occasionally, famous human individuals were deified and worshipped. King Amenhotep I and his mother Queen Ahmose Nefertari received a cult from the royal necropolis workers whose village at Deir el-Medina had been founded by this king, and Imhotep, the first minister and architect of King Dos's step pyramid at Saqqara, was later worshipped as the founder of medical science and a god of medicine. The Greeks who became resident in Egypt ultimately identified him with their own god of medicine, Asclepios. Personal piety. Evidence for popular religion and personal piety comes from literary sources, and from objects discovered at settlement sites, particularly the villages and towns of the royal necropolis workmen. Their deities included those with widespread appeal such as Biz and Tawat, and also some with local associations such as the Peak of the West, the personification of the mountain behind the Valley of the Kings, and the deified rulers Amenhotep I and Ahmose Nefertari at Deir el-Medina, and 1973. In this community, there is also evidence of the worship of several foreign gods, including Syrian deities. Elsewhere, at Kahun, another royal necropolis town, some objects and practices, distinctive altar stands and intramural burials of babies within the town, may indicate the presence of religious activities which were related to immigrant sections within these communities. At Deir el-Medina, we can gain a rare insight into one aspect of personal piety, provided by the memorial stelae, inscribed stones, set up by the workmen in some of the offering chapels. In these inscriptions, the men sometimes appeal to the gods for mercy, and confess their sins, in a rare expression of humility, or they thank the gods for their own delivery or that of their family members from illnesses which were believed to be the result of personal transgressions. Impiety and blasphemy were apparently regarded as major sins, and blindness was considered to be a particular punishment for offending the gods. The high level of literacy at Deir el-Medina may explain the existence of these texts in this particular location. The men wrote down concepts here that had existed elsewhere in Egypt but were left unexpressed, but an alternative explanation is that these were new ideas, perhaps introduced by Syrian immigrants. For other literary evidence of morality and ethics, the much more formal wisdom texts provide our major source. Another aspect of popular religion is represented by the use of the oracle at Deir el-Medina. Here, the priests, chosen from amongst the workmen themselves, had a surprising degree of autonomy, and one of their functions was to hold up the god's statue in front of the petitioner and move it in response to his inquiry. It was believed that, through this oracle, the deified Amenhotep I gave advice on a range of matters including personal and family concerns. The oracle also provided an alternative to unacceptable rulings given on cases presented in the local law courts. Also, the priests participated in local festivals, when the god's statues were paraded through the town. At Kahun, there is evidence of the practice of non-state, secular or private, magic, David 1997, 131-41. Local magicians exercised their skills to protect individuals against their fears of sickness, hunger, thirst, drowning, asphyxiation, hostile attack and dangerous animals. 94, 76-89. When Kahun was excavated in the 1890s, the house of a local magician was uncovered and found to contain a sacred mask, which was worn to imitate Biset, the female counterpart of Biz, and a set of magical equipment. The key feature of personal religion in Egypt revolved around the domestic worship carried out in the houses. This was probably often performed in a special, separate area of the house, in front of the god's shrine which held the deity's statue and a selection of stelae. Utensils used in the rituals included offering tables, water jars, vases and braziers. The rites probably copied the rituals performed in the temples of the state or local gods, and involved the presentation of food offerings and libations, and the burning of incense in the presence of the divine statues. In addition to a deep personal faith and a close relationship with their domestic gods, it is evident that the Egyptians believed that each individual was responsible for the good or evil deeds they performed during life, on which depended their ultimate fate in the next world. This was decided at the day of judgment which every person faced at the time of death. The goddess of fate or destiny was present on the day of judgment. Her name, She, meant that which is decreed, and she was closely associated with the ram-headed creator god, Khnum. She was also present at each person's birth. The Egyptians believed that individual fate or destiny was established at the time of birth, and ultimately determined the manner of each person's death. Sometimes, fate was also considered to control the course of each individual's life, with its successes and misfortunes, but freedom of action and the flexibility to act for good or evil were also important factors which were weighed and considered at the Day of Judgment. The Egyptians used hemerology, the determination of lucky and unlucky days, to assist them in achieving desired results throughout life, but this concept was derived from mythology rather than astrology. The Egyptians had a long-established interest in astronomy, and included star ceilings with charts of the heavens and tables of the nocturnal movements of stars in their tombs and temples. They also devised a calendar which was based on their agricultural year. Astrology was brought to Egypt from Mesopotamia in later times, possibly in the Persian period, c. 450 BCE. Funerary beliefs and customs. The concept of the personality. The ancient Egyptian concept of the human personality was complex, and directly influenced their ideas of the afterlife. Some elements, such as the individual's name, were regarded as an integral part of the personality, while the body was thought to provide an essential link between the deceased once he had attained his afterlife, and his former earthly existence. The body had to be preserved from decay in order to ensure that a recognizable likeness of the deceased remained in the tomb, so that his spirit could return to his body and thus obtain sustenance from the food offerings placed in the funerary chapel. Some elements, however, were regarded as immortal and indestructible parts of an individual. The Ka, often translated as spirit, was the person's life force or essential being which, after death, became free and immortal, although it retained a vital link with the tomb and the body. The Ba, usually translated as soul, was a force that could travel outside the tomb so that its owner could experience places that he had enjoyed when he was alive. The Ark was another supernatural power which assisted both the dead and the living. In order to allow the deceased tomb owner to regain his life force, a special ritual was performed by the priest at the funeral. Known as the ceremony of opening the mouth, this involved using an adze, a carpenter's tool, rather like an axe, to touch the mouth, hands and feet of the mummy, all the model figurines, and the figures represented in the mural scenes. It was believed that this would animate them to act on behalf of the deceased. The afterlife. Several different kinds of afterlife were envisaged. The kings were expected to pass their eternity in the heavens, sailing with the gods in the sacred bark. The nobility and middle classes, however, prepared lavish tombs where they planned to spend part of their afterlife. Each tomb was named the House of the Ka, and closely followed the layout and design of contemporary domestic architecture. The burial chamber represented the bedroom, the offering chapel was the equivalent of the reception hall, and the storerooms held the owner's goods and possessions. Food and drink were provided for the dead by means of a funerary ritual performed by his relatives, or by a Ka priest who was paid from the deceased's estate to undertake this obligation. In the event that human agents neglected these duties, a menu of provisions was inscribed inside the tomb, which could be magically activated to ensure eternal sustenance. Essentially, the wall decoration and contents of these tombs were designed to provide a pleasant hereafter for the deceased. From the Middle Kingdom onwards, democratization of religious beliefs and a new emphasis on the cult of Osiris fostered the concept that everyone, regardless of status or wealth, could spend eternity in the realm of Osiris. Griffiths 1980. This kingdom was situated in the underworld, and the only means of entry was for the individual to perform satisfactorily at the Day of Judgment, when a person's actions during life were assessed. In Osiris' kingdom, each person was allocated a small plot of land, which they were expected to cultivate. The wealthy classes, on the other hand, sought to avoid this duty by continuing to prepare comfortable tombs where they hoped to provide themselves with an alternative eternity. The priests attempted to rationalize and integrate these three concepts of the afterlife, but this was never satisfactorily achieved, and an individual's expectation of eternity continued to depend largely on his status in this world. Tomb and pyramid development. In the predynastic period, the earliest pit graves housed the burials of community leaders and ordinary people, but in circa 3400 BCE a new type of tomb was introduced for the ruling classes. This consisted of a brick-lined substructure underground which housed the burial, and a mud brick, bench-shaped superstructure which marked the site of the tomb above ground. Because of its shape, Egyptologists use the term mastaba, which comes from the Arabic word meaning bench-shaped, for this type of burial place. By the early Old Kingdom, circa 2600 BCE, the kings had started to construct pyramids to house their own burials, But the nobles and officials continued to use mastaba tombs, while the rest of the population was still interred in pit graves. Burial customs changed again when the Old Kingdom collapsed, and the nobility, to underline their independence and personal power, moved away from the royal burial sites and built their tombs in the cliffs alongside the river, in their own areas of political influence. This practice continued in the Middle Kingdom, even when pyramids were reintroduced for royal burials. By the New Kingdom, pyramids were no longer used and both royal and private tombs were now located on the west bank of the river, opposite the capital city, Thebes. Expense involved in constructing pyramids and their vulnerability to tomb robbers had persuaded the kings to build hidden tombs, excavated deep into the natural rock of the area known today as the Valley of the Kings. Nearby, similar tombs were prepared for some queens and princes of the New Kingdom at various sites, Weeks 1992. These royal tombs consisted of a series of passages and chambers, and were decorated with scenes and texts from the various funerary books, depicting the dangers the royal owner would have to encounter and defeat before he attained eternity. Scattered over the same mountainside were the tombs of the officials and dignitaries of these reigns. Their tombs were also cut into the mountainside. They incorporated an underground burial chamber and an offering chapel above ground, which was decorated with scenes of everyday life and food production, to ensure that the owner would have eternal sustenance and enjoyment in the next world. Despite these lavish precautions, however, both royal and private tombs were robbed extensively in antiquity. The Theban necropolis ceased to be used after Dynasty 20, when the next dynasty moved its capital to Tanis in the north. Here, they built subterranean tombs within the city complex which remained undiscovered until 1939 when Pierre Montet revealed the royal treasure buried there. Tomb art. Major features of the tombs and temples are the scenes that decorate their walls. In the temples, many scenes represent the rites once performed in special areas of the building, while in the tombs, they represent locations and situations which formed an integral part of the owner's passage to the afterlife and his eternal existence. All these scenes, based on the concept of sympathetic magic, were designed to bring about desired events or results. They were never placed on the walls simply for decoration or even for spiritual inspiration. Because they had this primary function, however, the human figures and objects in the scenes were represented in a way that often puzzles the modern observer, and in order to understand this art it is necessary to study the underlying principles. Although the Egyptians themselves have left no record of the concepts which underlay their art, the work of a German Egyptologist, Heinrich Schaeffer, has illuminated our understanding of this subject. Schaeffer 1974. He defined two fundamental types of art, conceptual, or aspective, and perceptual, or perspective. According to his theory, conceptual art represents the essential character and features of a person or object, whereas perceptual art shows the figure or object from the particular viewpoint or stance of an individual artist. Schaeffer claimed that the ancient Egyptians were the most skillful exponents of conceptual art. Prompted by their specific religious requirements to show people and objects as they really were, their main aim was to ensure that all the parts of the whole were displayed so that they could be brought to life by magic for the owner's future use. Tomb equipment. From the Middle Kingdom onwards, circa 1900 BCE, because of an increased emphasis on an individual's hereafter, the provision of tomb equipment became a widespread priority, and even the less wealthy now aspired to prepare and equip their burials as extensively as possible. From the Middle Kingdom, there was the nest of coffins, which usually included a rectangular outer coffin and an inner anthropoid, body-shaped one. In later times, these were replaced by 2 or 3 anthropoid coffins decorated with scenes and spells from the funerary books. Canopic jars and model figurines usually also accompanied the burial. Symbolism. An important aspect of funerary beliefs and customs was the symbolism associated with death and rebirth. In particular, the symbolism of hieroglyphs as a life force was emphasized in the tomb inscriptions and funerary texts. Not only were hieroglyphs the means of conveying in writing the syntax, grammar and vocabulary of a contemporary language, but the very act of writing these sacred characters was believed to renew life itself, and to provide the owner of the texts with magical protection and the means to overcome death. Concerns specific to this religion. Some aspects of religion provide specific and distinctive information about Egyptian civilization. A few key examples are provided here. The Amarna Revolution. One of the most significant events in Egypt's political and religious history occurred towards the end of Dynasty 18. When Amenhotep IV, the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, succeeded to the throne, he instigated a series of unprecedented changes. He developed the cult of the Aten, sun's disk, into a form of solar monotheism which focused on the worship of the life force present in the sun. Previously, the kings had each promoted a special royal patron deity who protected their own particular dynasty, but they had never attempted to create an exclusive cult which did not tolerate the existence of other gods, and the state religion had always encompassed a multitude of deities with their own temples and cults. In the early years of his reign, Amenhotep IV lived with his wife Nefertiti in the capital city of Thebes, where he began to promote the Aten's cult, building temples to the god in proximity to the great temple complex of the dynasty's supreme deity, Amen-Re. However, when the king's relationship with the priesthood of Amen-Re began to deteriorate, he took decisive steps to impose his form of monotheism on Egypt. The priesthoods of all other gods were disbanded and the deities' names were expunged from the monuments. The revenues that had supported these cults were now diverted to the Aten. A change of name from Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, servant of the Aten, emphasized the king's allegiance to the new god, and Nefertiti added the new name of Neferneferuaten. From the evidence of the scenes which once decorated the early Aten temples at Thebes, Nefertiti played a unique and central role, equivalent to that of the king, in the god's cult, exceeding the traditional ritual duties of queens. Smith and Redford 1977. Finally, Akhenaten moved his political and religious capital from Thebes to a new site midway along the Nile which, he claimed, had been selected by the Aten. This virgin site was uncontaminated by association with any other god. Here, the king built the city of Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, which is known today as Amarna or Tel El Amarna. The royal court, accompanied by the officials, craftsmen and people required to establish a new royal residence and capital now also moved to Akhenaten, Aldred 1988. The city was constructed over an area of 20 square kilometers on the east bank of the river, and supplied with food from agricultural land on the west bank. The whole site was delineated by 14 boundary stelae inscribed with Akhenaten's conditions which related to the establishment and limits of his capital. The city included several royal palaces, administrative quarters, military barracks, a records office, where the famous Amarna letters were discovered, detailing the royal family's correspondence and relations with contemporary foreign rulers, substantial villas for the officials, and a village which was probably built to house the workmen engaged in constructing the royal tomb, which lay in a distant desert valley, and the tombs of the courtiers and officials, excavated in the eastern cliffs encircling the city. Among the most important features of Akhenaten were the temples dedicated to the Aten which differed markedly from the traditional temples. Instead of the customary dark, roofed buildings with their cult statues, the Aten temples were roofless and had no statues because the sun, the Aten symbol, was believed to enter the temple to receive the cult offerings. The cult of the Aten is not described in any one literary source, but inscriptional and archaeological evidence from Amarna and Thebes has enabled scholars to interpret the basic doctrine and beliefs. At Akhenaten, archaeological evidence has been gleaned from the temples and wall scenes in the courtiers' tombs which depicted the relationship between the royal family and the Aten rather than the owner's expected existence in the afterlife. The famous hymn to the Aten, inscribed on a courtier's tomb wall, described the main elements of Atenism. At Thebes, the earlier Aten temples were later dismantled by Akhenaten's successors, and used as infill for new constructions in the Temple of Amenri at Karnak. During dismantling of these buildings for a restoration program of the temple carried out in modern times, archaeologists revealed some 36,000 decorated and inscribed blocks which had once been part of the original Aten buildings. Using a computer, they were able to reassemble the information on many of these blocks, revealing many of the unique and remarkable features which had distinguished the early years of this religious experiment. Smith and Redford 1977. From the hymn to the Aten and other sources, it is evident that the god was regarded as the beneficent creator of all living things, including mankind, animals and plants. This creative force was expressed through the light and heat of the sun. The sun's disk, Aten, was the symbol of the god, visible in the heavens to all on earth, while the king himself was regarded as the divine incarnation who shared the deity's nature and acted as sole divine agent and representative on earth. In effect, the king and the god became interchangeable, and the king's power was no longer rivaled by that of a separate priesthood who served another god. The new faith essentially restored the kingship to the preeminence it had enjoyed in the early Old Kingdom. When this historical period was first revealed to modern scholars in the early 20th century, they regarded Atenism as a revolutionary concept without precedent in Egypt. However, it was not a new invention. The Aten, as the sun disk representing one aspect of the sun god Re, first appeared in the Middle Kingdom, but Thutmose IV, Akhenaten's grandfather, and his father, Amenhotep III, developed the Aten's cult, although there is no evidence that they attempted to make the god unique or exclusive. It is now recognized that Akhenaten's one truly revolutionary idea was the introduction of a monotheistic concept of the Aten. Other aspects, such as the god's role as a universal god of foreign peoples as well as Egyptians, and his powers as creator, can be identified in earlier religious trends of the New Kingdom, particularly the cult of Amenri, where they were used to emphasize the god's significance as a unifying force for Egypt's empire. A style of representation in painting and sculpture, which is now referred to as Amarna art, flourished during this period, and was inextricably linked with the religious developments, Aldred 1988. Characterized by a new emphasis on reality, the art portrays the plant and animal life of Egypt with a refreshing naturalism, as expressions of the Aten's creative power. The royal family is also portrayed with a realism and informality not found in the traditional art, which was itself an expression of conventional religion. However, the art is particularly notable for its representation of the human figure, grossly exaggerating certain physical features, the elongated face and head and an apparently malformed body with emaciated neck and pronounced breasts and thighs. It has been suggested that these features may be based on the king's own physical condition, perhaps reflecting a glandular disorder, but his body has never been identified, and presumably remains undiscovered, and so this speculation remains tentative. Another equally valid view is that the art is simply experimental, marking a complete break with earlier religious and artistic conventions. Although the royal family and court promoted and supported the cult of the Aten, there is little evidence that it was favored by the general population. It enhanced the king's own status and position, but offered no moral philosophy or popular mythology to attract other worshippers. It apparently proposed no alternative concept of an individual hereafter to replace that offered by the cult of Osiris, but seemed to promote the belief that, as in the Old Kingdom, individual immortality could only be achieved through the king's bounty. It is therefore not surprising that, after Akhenaten's death, his religious innovations did not survive, and following the reigns of his immediate successors, Smenkhkare and Tutankhamun, when there was a partial return to traditional religion, a counter-revolution was pursued during the reigns of Ea and Horem. The court returned to Memphis in the reign of Tutankhamun, and Thebes was restored as the country's religious capital, while, under later kings, Akhenaten was finally abandoned. Akhenaten's motives in promoting Atenism as a form of monotheism have been widely discussed. Was he a visionary, prompted by religious ideas to establish a new order, or was he a political opportunist who used this religious upheaval to overthrow the priesthood of Amenri and the threat it posed to the power of the kingship? Redford, 1984. Perhaps both played their part in influencing this unique and unrepeated religious experiment. The tomb of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was possibly the son of Amenhotep III by a secondary wife, although it has also been proposed that his father was Akhenaten. He married Ankhesenamun, the third daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and succeeded Smenkhkare, who was probably his elder brother, to the throne. His short reign of some 10 years was perhaps most notable for the steps he took after the Amarna Revolution, to restore, at least in part, the worship of the traditional gods. He ascended the throne as a child and, on the advice of his courtiers, began to reverse Akhenaten's policies. He and his wife changed their names from Tutankhaten and Ankhesenpaten to Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, emphasizing their allegiance to the traditional deity, Amun, Amenri, in place of the Aten. However, the king's coronation may have taken place at Akhenaten, and during his reign the Aten's cult was probably allowed to continue alongside those of the reinstated traditional deities. Thebes was once again Egypt's foremost religious center and, when Tutankhamun died as a young king without any living heirs, he was buried in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank opposite Thebes. This tomb, with its virtually intact contents, was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, the Egyptologist working on behalf of his patron, Lord Carnarvon. The discovery and subsequent excavation of this tomb and its treasure have ensured Tutankhamun's fame in modern times. The rarity of a virtually intact royal tomb was also significant because it could provide new information about royal funerary beliefs and customs. The Valley of the Kings housed the burials of most of the rulers, and a few non-royal persons, of dynasties 18, 19 and 20, and although, so far, 62 tombs have been uncovered there, the only largely intact royal burial to be discovered has been that of Tutankhamun, Reeves 1990. Howard Carter, who had worked as an artist and archaeologist in Egypt for many years, was engaged by the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who had gone out to Egypt in 1903 in an attempt to improve his health, to work at Thebes. When the concession to excavate in the Valley of the Kings became available in 1914, Lord Carnarvon took it, and after the First World War they began to search there, in 1919, for the tomb of Tutankhamun. The earlier discovery by another archaeologist of a small pit that contained the materials used in Tutankhamun's mummification and the remains of his funerary meal led Carter to pursue his exploration in this area. Starting work on the 1st of November, he revealed the entrance to the tomb 3 days later, and discovered that a stone staircase led down from this to an intact sealed doorway. The tomb was opened on the 26th of November, and although it had been robbed twice in antiquity, most of the contents remained intact. Extensive robbery had been prevented here because the rubble from the excavation of a later tomb belonging to Ramesses VI had been piled over the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb and had hidden it from view. The four-roomed, stone-cut tomb was very small in comparison with some others in the valley, and was almost certainly not intended for the king, whose early death was probably sudden and unexpected. There was some evidence of hasty preparation of the tomb and its contents. However, the burial contained a wealth of funerary goods including clothes, jewelry, personal possessions, games, weapons and canopic jars, as well as the 3 magnificent golden coffins and the gold face mask which covered and encased the king's mummified body. Carter worked in a patient and meticulous manner over many years to remove, record, clean and restore the vast array of objects in the tomb, which were subsequently taken to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. A definitive and complete study of the objects is still awaited, although some groups have been published. The tomb has provided unique and unparalleled information about the elaborate funerary customs surrounding the burial of even a minor, relatively insignificant, and short-lived king. Mummification techniques. Mummification occurred in a number of ancient societies, although it is best exemplified in the human and animal remains of Egypt. In some countries, natural conditions, a hot or cold climate, the dryness of the sand in which the body is interred, or the exclusion of air from the burial, produce the ideal environment for natural or unintentional mummification. Sometimes, these conditions have been intentionally enhanced so that the bodies could be even more effectively preserved for social or religious reasons. The Egyptians took this to extreme lengths by developing and utilizing a range of sophisticated techniques that involved physical intrusion in the body and the use of chemical and other agents to preserve the soft tissues. From the visible appearance of the bodies, and in terms of the preservation of the tissue structures as revealed by investigative biomedical techniques, it is evident that the Egyptians achieved the most successful results. The geography of Egypt created environmental conditions that created natural, unintentional mummies. Because of the scarcity of cultivable land, from earliest times the dead were buried away from the areas required for houses, crops and animal husbandry. They occupied shallow pit graves on the edge of the desert where the dryness of the sand and the sun's heat combined to desiccate the body tissues before decomposition started. In circa 3400 BCE, advances in building techniques led to the construction of the mastaba tombs for the wealthiest classes. However, because the bodies in these tombs were now enclosed in brick-lined burial chambers, where the heat and dry sand provided by the pit graves were missing, the bodies rapidly decomposed. By this time, there seems to have been a strongly held belief, accredited in inscriptions of the later periods, that it was essential to preserve the body in a recognizable form so that the individual's spirit could return to it at will, in order to use it to gain spiritual sustenance from the actual food offerings placed at the tomb. The Egyptians began to experiment with practical ways of meeting this religious requirement. At first, they tried to recreate the shape of the body by encasing it in layers of fine linen which were coated with stucco plaster to emphasize the natural contours. Additional features on the breasts, genitalia and face were molded and painted onto the form. However, despite this elaborate outer structure, the body still decomposed into a skeletal form underneath the wrappings. The first evidence of true mummification dates to the predynastic period. Hundreds of years later, in circa 2600 BCE, the viscera, major abdominal and thoracic organs, of Queen Hetephes, mother of King Cheops who built the Great Pyramid at Giza, were found in a box in her nearby tomb at Giza. Analysis of these packets confirmed that they had been treated with natron, a naturally occurring chemical substance used by the Egyptians to dehydrate the body tissues. Thus, this find produced evidence that the two main stages of mummification, evisceration and dehydration, were already known and practiced. The word mummy is derived from the Persian or Arabic word mumia, which means pitch or bitumen. This is now generally used as a term for a naturally or artificially preserved body where putrefaction has been arrested because the tissues have been desiccated. Originally, however, mumia was the name given to the black, bituminous substance which oozed forth from the Mummy Mountain in Persia which, from medieval times, was credited with special healing and medicinal properties. When this supply became inadequate to meet demand, the vendors sought out an alternative source and, since the preserved bodies of the ancient Egyptians had a bituminous appearance, they assumed that they had similar beneficial properties and sold the tissue as a medicinal ingredient for treatment in Europe. Consequently, the word mumia was also used to describe these Egyptian preserved bodies. There are no extant literary sources from ancient Egypt that provide a detailed account of the mummification procedure, although religious and ritual references occur in many texts, including the ritual of embalming preserved on 2 papyri of the Roman period. Also, there are no pictorial records, although some stages in the preparation of a mummy occur on the walls of 2 Theban tombs. The only detailed descriptions of the procedure are found in the writings of 2 Greek historians, Herodotus, 5th century BCE, and Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BCE. From their information, and the evidence provided by scientific studies carried out on the mummies themselves, see above, pp 54-5, it is possible to reconstruct a fairly accurate picture of the main stages of mummification. According to Herodotus, there were 3 main methods which could be selected on the basis of cost. The cheapest method involved the injection of an unspecified liquid via the rectum, followed by treatment with natron. The second method, the one also used for animal mummification, was similar, and included injection of cedar oil via the rectum and treatment with natron. The most expensive method involved the most complicated procedures. First, the viscera and abdominal contents were removed through an incision made in the flank. The heart was left in situ because it was considered to be the location of a person's intellect and emotions. Also, the kidneys were not removed, but no religious explanation is given for this. Next, the body was cleansed and washed, the cavities were packed with bandages, herbs and spices, and the incision was closed. Both the viscera and the body were packed with dry natron to dehydrate the tissues. Natron, a mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate with some natural impurities, was found in natural deposits in the Wadi Natron in Egypt. After a period of 40 days, when the dehydration process was complete, the body was ready for the final application of resins and oils. In some mummies, the preserved viscera were stored separately in special containers known as canopic jars. In others, they were made into packages and reinserted inside the body cavities, or made into one package and placed on the legs of the mummy. In some mummies, from at least as early as the Middle Kingdom, excerebration was practiced. The brain was removed either through a passage chiseled through the left nostril and ethmoid bone into the cranial cavity, or through the base of the skull, or through a trepanned orbit, a window cut through the eye socket. The extracted brain tissue was discarded, but it was never possible to remove all the brain, and accidentally some always remained behind in the cranial cavity. Another development in the mummification procedure occurred in Dynasty 21, when subcutaneous packing, the insertion of mud, butter, sawdust and other materials through incisions made in the skin, was introduced in an attempt to preserve the rounded contours and original appearance of the owner. The mummification process, which lasted 70 days from the arrival of the body at the embalmer's workshop to its eventual return to the family for burial, continued for some 3,000 years, down into the Christian period. Originally introduced for royalty, it gradually became available on the basis of ability to pay, and by the Greco-Roman period it was widely practiced by the middle classes. Poor people continued to be buried in the shallow pit graves on the edge of the desert. The richest source for the study of royal mummification practices in the New Kingdom is the bodies of some of the kings and queens which were removed from their original tombs. These had been desecrated by tomb robbers, and the bodies were reburied in 2 caches by the high priests at Thebes in Dynasty 21, presumably in a pious attempt to give these rulers a second chance of survival in the hereafter. One cache, deposited in the tomb of Queen Inhapi near Deir el-Bori, on the west bank at Thebes, was discovered by the inhabitants of the nearby modern village of Kerner. This eventually led to investigations by the Antiquities Service in 1881 and the removal of the mummies to the Cairo Museum. The other cache, buried in the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings, was discovered by the archaeologist Victor Lauret in 1898. Again, the mummies were transported to Cairo, where Professor Grafton Elliott Smith subsequently unwrapped and autopsied them. This work provided the foundation for his definitive study of mummification and funerary practices in the New Kingdom, and several later studies have added further information. See above, pp 53-5. Animal cults. From earliest times, the Egyptians appear to have regarded many animals as the representatives of a multitude of gods and goddesses who could take the form or some of the physical characteristics of animals. In predynastic times, circa 5000 to 3100 BCE, there were special cemeteries for animals where dogs or jackals, sheep and cows were interred in graves that were separate from but close to human burials. The animals were carefully wrapped in linen or matting covers. In later times, there were large animal cemeteries at special locations such as Bubastis, the cult center of Bastet, the cat goddess, Saqqara, where there were necropolises for different animals including ibises, falcons, cows and bulls, and Tuna el Jebel, where vast underground chambers housed the mummified remains of ibises and baboons, the two animals sacred to the god Thoth who was worshipped locally at Hermopolis, Ashmunin. Animal mummification was widely practiced, and it was apparently customary to use the second procedure described by Herodotus. There seem to have been several categories of animals that were mummified and given burials. First, there were the cult animals attached to the temples, in which the spirit of the divine owner of the temple was thought to reside. These were regarded as alternative forms of the divine cult statue, and were revered and treated with the utmost respect. When the cult animal died, it was mummified and buried in an elaborate manner. Perhaps the most notable examples are the Apis bulls associated with Osiris, which were worshipped at Memphis. They were eventually interred in great sarcophagi in underground tomb chambers in the Serapeum at Saqqara. Some animals, however, were beloved pets which their owners wished to honor with the provision of a coffin and a burial site. Again, others appear to have been animals bred and raised in compounds near to particular temples which were dedicated to animal deities. These could be purchased by pilgrims, and subsequently sacrificed, mummified and buried in special cemeteries, as offerings to the temple deity. This veneration of animals because they were closely associated with particular deities permeated Egyptian religion. In the early predynastic villages, when cults were largely localized and unconnected, many deities seem to have been represented in animal or fetish form. As well as the animal burials, animal amulets and statuettes were placed in the human graves, presumably to provide the deceased with the power and strength of particular animals, and to supply a source of food that could be activated by means of magic in the next world. Animal forms also occurred on painted pottery found in the graves, and many of the slate palettes provided as part of the burial equipment were carved to represent animal shapes. Gradually, in the early dynasties, the gods who were originally shown in an entirely animal form underwent an evolution in which many came to be represented with animal or bird heads attached to human bodies. In the late period and the Greco-Roman era, when Egypt's nationalism was constantly threatened by foreign invasion and occupation, animal cults were promoted as expressions of national loyalty, and some were even adopted by the newly established foreign residents. It is unclear why the Egyptians continued to accord animals such an important role in religion over such a long period. Some deities may have been given animal characteristics because these animals were feared, and it was hoped that veneration of the god in the animal form might deflect the creature's anger and lessen the danger, whereas other animals were regarded as beneficent allies of mankind, and were worshipped accordingly. Whatever the origin of the animal cults in Egypt, it seems clear that the Egyptians regarded both animals and the representation of animal characteristics as means through which the god's divinity could be made manifest. The extent to which animal cults were developed and promoted in Egypt seems to have been unique in the ancient Near East. Egypt's religious legacy. Biblical connections. The history of the Jews and the civilization of ancient Egypt are closely interwoven. There has been much debate regarding certain individuals and events in the Old Testament, as well as the related literary and archaeological evidence. Egyptian and biblical texts. The main difference between Egyptian religion and Christianity and Judaism is the fact that the former developed around ritual and cultic practices, whereas the latter were based on a belief in God's revelation of the truth to mankind, as preserved in the scriptures. However, there are clearly some parallels to be drawn between the Egyptian texts and the Bible, particularly the books of Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Psalms and the Song of Solomon. One special example is provided by the hymn to the Aten, inscribed on a wall in the tomb of the courtier Atamana, which presents a detailed description of the doctrine of Atanism. Although this hymn incorporated some earlier ideas, it also gave unprecedented importance to the god's unique and exclusive nature, to his role as universal creator, and to the king's position within the cult. Some passages in the hymn show a close resemblance to verses in Psalm 104 in the Bible, although it is unclear if there was direct borrowing between these texts or if they are derived from a lost, common source. The following selection of passages shows a particularly close association of ideas. Example 1. Psalm 104:14. He caused the grass to grow for the cattle, and the herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth. Hymn to the Aten. Your rays give sustenance to all fields, when you shine forth, they live and grow for you. You make the seasons to nurture all you have made. Example 2. Psalm 104:20-21. Thou makest darkness, and it is night, wherein all the beasts of the forest do creep forth. The young lions roar after their prey, and seek their meat from God. Hymn to the Aten. Every lion comes forth from its den, and all serpents bite. The darkness hovers, and the earth is silent while their Creator rests in his horizon. Example 3. Psalm 104:22-23. The sun ariseth, they gather themselves together, and lay them down in their dens. Man goeth forth unto his work and to his labor until the evening. Hymn to the Aten. The earth grows bright when you arise in the horizon, the two lands make festival. Awakened, they stand on their feet, for you have raised them up. The entire land goes about its work. Another example where biblical texts may have been influenced by earlier Egyptian writings is evident in the Egyptian wisdom literature and the Book of Proverbs. One wisdom text, the instruction of Ptah-hotep, which is attributed to the Old Kingdom, presents ideas which also occur in Proverbs, but the clearest evidence of influence is found in the instruction of Amenemop, composed in the Ramesside period, circa 1250 BCE. At a time immediately before the date most widely accepted by current scholarship for the Exodus. At this time, the Israelites would probably have been most influenced by Egypt. However, again, an alternative explanation is that both texts may be derived from a common but undiscovered source. A few examples from Amenemop and Proverbs will demonstrate the similarity of these texts. Example 1. Proverbs 22:24-25. Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man thou shalt not go, lest thou learn his ways, and get a snare to thy soul. Amenemop, chapter 10. Do not force yourself to greet the heated man. For then you injure your own heart. Do not say greetings to him falsely, while there is terror in your belly. Lichtheim 1976, 154. Example 2. Proverbs 22:1. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. Amenemop, chapter 6. Poverty is better in the hand of the god than wealth in the storehouse. Bread is better with a happy heart than wealth with vexation. Lichtheim 1976, 152. Example 3. Proverbs 23:10. Remove not the old landmark, and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. Amenemop, chapter 6. Do not move the markers on the borders of the fields, do not shift the position of the measuring cord. Do not be greedy for a cubit of land, nor encroach on the boundaries of a widow. Lichtheim 1976, 151. Events and personalities. Historical evidence for the biblical Exodus, and for the roles played by Joseph and Moses, has been sought in Egyptian literature and archaeology. There has also been historical comment, for example, the Jewish historian Josephus, 1st century CE, referred to Joseph and Moses, and the possibility that the Exodus could be identified with the expulsion of the Hyksos by the Theban princes of Dynasty 17, circa 1567 BCE. According to the biblical account, Joseph was sold into slavery by his jealous half-brothers and sent to Egypt, where he eventually acquired great wealth and power. He became vizier and brought his family, the tribe of Israel, into Egypt, where they remained for over 400 years. Joseph achieved great honor and was embalmed and buried in Egypt. However, a later pharaoh coerced the descendants of Joseph's family to work as laborers on building sites. Eventually, they were led out of bondage by Moses, and in Sinai they received God's covenant in the form of the Ten Commandments. Finally, they established a new homeland in the region that became known as Israel. Moses, subsequently regarded by the Jews as their great spiritual leader, was the child of Hebrew slaves who had been rescued from the bulrushes by an Egyptian princess and reared as a royal prince. He later defied the pharaoh's refusal to release the Hebrews, and consequently led his people out of Egypt. The Bible recounts how, when the pharaoh attempted to recapture them by force, the windblown waters, probably of the Sea of Reeds, parted briefly to allow the Hebrews to cross, but then engulfed the royal chariot force who were in pursuit. Although these events were recorded in some detail in biblical sources and were regarded as key events in the political and religious history of Israel, no reference to them is found in Egyptian sources. However, it is unlikely that the Egyptians would have wished to record a relatively unimportant uprising on the part of their workforce, particularly as, for them, there was an unsuccessful outcome. In this respect, the Egyptian sources do not offer any assistance in fixing firm dates for these events. A more recent theory has suggested that Joseph may have entered Egypt amongst the groups of Semitic-speaking peoples who established themselves in the Delta and Upper Egypt from the Old Kingdom, circa 2340 BCE, down to the Hyksos period. It has also been proposed that Joseph could possibly be identified with Uyo, father-in-law of Amenhotep III. However, despite continuing academic debate, the most widely accepted date for the Exodus is during Dynasty 19, when the working conditions of the Hebrews described in the Bible reflect known events in Egypt, when large groups of itinerant laborers, the Apiru, who had lived in the Delta for centuries, were coerced to work on large building projects, and to make bricks for the cities of Avaris and Pyramses. Although scholars have tentatively identified Merneptah as the pharaoh of the Exodus, a stela was discovered in 1896 CE which Merneptah had usurped from Amenhotep III. The inscription, added on Merneptah's orders, gives details of Egypt's Libyan War and also supplies the only known reference to Israel in an Egyptian text. Since this proves that Israel was already founded and established by the middle of Merneptah's reign, it is generally accepted that Ramesses II, Merneptah's father and predecessor, was more probably the pharaoh of the Exodus. The contribution to Hellenistic culture, Christianity and Islam. Egypt and the classical world. Following the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, when the country was ruled first by the Ptolemies and then as part of the Roman Empire, there were many changes in political and social administration. Because of the large numbers of Greeks who settled in Egypt, profound developments also occurred in religion. At first, Greeks and Egyptians tended to pursue their separate religious beliefs and practices, although state initiatives promoted the establishment of some cults that would unite both peoples and secure the Ptolemies' dynastic claim to Egypt. However, the most important of these gods, Serapis, who was given a Greek appearance but incorporated popular aspects of earlier Egyptian deities, achieved only limited success. The revival of the Egyptian practice of deifying and worshipping certain dead rulers provided an official dynastic cult to justify the Ptolemies' claim to rule Egypt. The Greek and Roman rulers built and repaired temples dedicated to the Egyptian gods, which, apart from minor architectural variations, continued the tradition of the pharaonic temples. In this way, and by decreeing substantial concessions to the temples, they gained the support of the Egyptian priests and proved themselves to be legitimate pharaohs, able to claim ownership over the land and its people, which gave them the right to seize the country's economic benefits. The Greeks and Romans who became resident in this period adopted Egyptian funerary beliefs and practices, especially the mummification process, a custom which was probably accelerated by intermarriage between Egyptians and the immigrants. This hybridization of beliefs is evident in the new or changed forms of the mummy casings, and particularly in the mummy panel portrait which was now placed over the face of the deceased. Although this use of an image of the human face was Egyptian in concept, the artistic techniques and conventions demonstrated in the panels, which produced realistic likenesses of the owners instead of the stylized representations of pharaonic times, were drawn entirely from the Hellenistic world. The cults of some Egyptian deities such as Isis, Osiris and Amun were carried by traders and administrators to other parts of the Roman Empire, where they continued to enjoy great popularity because they combined human and divine characteristics and promised individual immortality. The legacy to Christianity and Islam. Egyptian concepts probably entered early Christian belief through both the biblical Old and New Testaments, and more directly through Egypt's influence on the Hellenistic world. Thus, the divine triads of the pharaonic period and the concept of the Trinity may be associated, while there are probably links between the cult of the Virgin Mary and the Isis cult. Again, basic strands in the mythology of Osiris, such as the cycle of death, rebirth and resurrection, as well as the significance of the Day of Judgment, can be traced in later ideas. In modern Egypt, although the population is mainly Muslim or Christian, some of the most popular festivals preserve ancient traditions. These include the festival of Shem el-Nessim, when the start of spring is celebrated as it was in the festival of Khoiak in antiquity, and the festival of Aru el-Nil, a national holiday which coincides with the inundation of the Nile which was faked in ancient times. Similarly, some modern ceremonies reflect ancient funerary practices, when food is taken to the grave by the deceased's family, and subsequently distributed amongst the poor. Bibliography. Aldred, circa 1988. Akhenaten, King of Egypt. London, Thames and Hudson. Allen, J.P., 1988. Genesis in Egypt, The Philosophy of Ancient Egyptian Creation Accounts. New Haven, Yale University Press. Bagnall, R.S., 1993. Egypt in Late Antiquity. Princeton, Princeton University Press. Borchardt, L., 1907. Das Grabdenkmal des Königs Eni Usuri, Leipzig, J. C. Hinrichsche Buchhandlung. Cerny, J. 1973. A Community of Workmen at Thebes in the Ramesside Period. Cairo, Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale du Caire. David, A. R., ed. 1979. The Manchester Museum Mummy Project. Manchester, Manchester University Press. 1981, A Guide to Religious Ritual at Abydos. Warminster, Aries and Phillips. 1997, The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt. 2nd Reverend Eden, London, Routledge. 1999, The Experience of Ancient Egypt. London, Routledge. 2000, Religion and Magic in Ancient Egypt. Harmonsworth, Penguin. Edwards, I.E.S., 1985. The Pyramids of Egypt. Harmonsworth, Penguin. Emery, W., born in 1961. Archaic Egypt. Harmonsworth, Penguin. Ehrman, A. 1971. Life in Egypt, Trans. H. M. Tirade. New York, Dover Publications. Fairman, H. W. 1945. The Consecration of an Egyptian Temple According to the Use of Edfu. Journal of Egyptian Archaeology 3275-91. Faulkner, R. O. 1969. The Ancient Egyptian Pyramid Texts. 2 volumes, Oxford, Oxford University Press. 1973–78. The Ancient Egyptian Coffin Texts. 3 volumes, Warminster, Aries and Phillips. Frankfurt, H. 1961. Ancient Egyptian Religion. New York, Columbia University Press. Griffiths, J. G. 1980. The Origins of Osiris and His Cult. 2nd Reverend Eden, Leiden, Brill. Hornung, E. 1971. Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt, the One and the Many. Ithaca, New York, Cornell University Press. Lichtheim, M. 1973, 1976, 1980. Ancient Egyptian Literature. 3 volumes, Berkeley, University of California Press. Morenz, S. 1973. Egyptian Religion, Trans. 8th Keep. London, Methuen. O'Connor, D. and D. Silverman 1995. Ancient Egyptian Kingship. Leiden, Brill. Pinch, G. 1994. Magic in Ancient Egypt. London, British Museum Press. Redford, D. Born in 1984. Akhenaten, the Heretic King. Princeton, Princeton University Press. Reeves, C. N. 1990. The Complete Tutankhamun. London, Thames and Hudson. Sornaran, S. 1980. The Priests of Ancient Egypt. New York, Grove Press. Schaeffer, H. 1974. Principles of Egyptian Art, Trans. And E. D. J. Baines, ed. with epilogue by E. Brunertraut. Oxford, Oxford University Press. Schaeffer, born in 1991. Religion in Ancient Egypt. London, Routledge. 1988, Temples of Ancient Egypt. London, I. B. Torais. Smith, G. E. 1991 Egyptian Mummies. 2nd Eden, London, Kegan Paul International. Smith, R. W. and D. B. Redford 1977. The Akhenaten Temple Project, 1, The Initial Discoveries. Warminster, Aries and Phillips. Weeks, K. R. 1992. The Theban Mapping Project and Work in KV5. In C. N. Reeves, ed., After Tutankhamun, Research and Excavation in the Royal Necropolis at Thebes. London, Kegan Paul, pp. 99–121.